Hello everyone, tonight we are diving deep into the swashbuckling world of pirates, hidden treasures, and perilous voyages with Robert Louis Stevenson's classic Treasure Island. Imagine, if you will, the creak of wooden planks underfoot, the scent of brine and tar in the air, the distant cry of gulls, and the glint of steel reflecting the sun on the open sea. It's a world where a wrong turn could mean walking the plank, and loyalty is as scarce as fresh water in the doldrums. Honestly, you probably won't survive 5 minutes in this story without getting scurvy or shanghaied, but from the safety of your bed, it's quite the ride. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And do me a favor, drop your current location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see how far our little bedtime history club reaches across the globe. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get going tonight. Our story begins not with a grand adventure on the high seas, but in the sleepy, somewhat soggy quietness of coastal England. Picture yourself, if you will, as young Jim Hawkins' sons, living a pretty normal, even a little boring life at the Admiral Benbow Inn. It's the kind of place where the most exciting event of the day is usually a storm brewing offshore or a traveling merchant needing a fresh pot of tea. You're there helping your mother, learning the ropes of running a modest establishment, perhaps dreaming of the day you'll sail the oceans, but mostly just making sure the stable is clean and the hearth is warm. The air usually smells of wood smoke, damp wool, and perhaps a faint whisper of stale ale from the bar, creating a comforting, predictable lull that has been your entire world. One blustery day, however, that soothing rhythm is shattered like a dropped porcelain cup. An old seaman, large and gruff, his pigtail tarred and a great saber scar streaking across his cheek, comes swaggering down the road. He's dressed like a man who's seen every storm, every port, and every kind of trouble the world has to offer. And you, as Jim, watch with a mixture of awe and apprehension. He's carrying a massive battered sea chest, clearly the focus of his affections and perhaps his paranoia, which he brings into the inn as if it were a fragile baby or a highly explosive device. This isn't just any new guest. This is Captain Billy Bones. A name you don't yet know carries the weight of 1,000 grim tales. He throws a few gold coins, pieces of 8, mind you, the kind you've only seen in books, onto the counter with a loud thud, demanding a room overlooking the sea and instant service. And look sharp about it, he growls, already embodying the perfect archetype of a surly Airbnb guest. Except this one could probably tie you into a very uncomfortable knot with his bare hands. He sets up a flagstaff, demanding anyone riding past the cove to notify him immediately of any passing ship, particularly small, suspicious vessels, like some ancient analog early warning system for rogue pirates. He stays, this captain, a dark, silent fixture by the fireplace, drinking himself into a constant, mumbling stupor of cheap rum. Every night as you clean the glasses and stoke the dying embers, you can hear his deep, rumbling sea shanties about dead men's chests and rum. It's the kind of background noise that initially feels exotic, but quickly becomes part of the furniture, a menacing growling, always-on radio. You've noticed how he never locks his massive sea chest, but always glances nervously at it, even in his drunken haze. This paradox of casual security and hypervigilance keeps you wondering what treasures or terrors might lie within. The captain's main preoccupation, besides prodigious drinking, is avoiding a man with one leg. This specific detail hangs heavy in the air, a constant unspoken threat. He constantly presses you for news of travelers, often offering you a shilling just to keep a sharp eye out for such a character, making you, a young innkeeper, into his personal lookout. It's an easy shilling for a quiet moment, but it comes with a gnawing unease. Sometimes he would even stare at his companions, perhaps your own father or Dr. Livesey, and bark out some demand for loyalty, muttering about those treacherous dog-washed bilge rats, a common term among real historical pirates for someone disloyal to the pirate crew, which often operated under strict, if violent, democratic principles when it came to dividing plunder and electing captains. One day, Dr. Livesey, the kind, calm village doctor, drops by. He's a local pillar of calm, rationality, and general decency, and he represents everything the captain is not. The captain, typically oblivious in his rum-induced fog, overhears Dr. Livesey hum a snatch of a sea song, probably one of the many bawdy tunes that float around coastal inns like dust bunnies. Suddenly, Captain Bones roars at the doctor, threatening him, claiming he'll break every bone in your body, an unfortunate turn of phrase for a man named Bones. Dr. Livesey, unfazed, calmly rebukes him, reminding the old salt that the village isn't afraid of his boisterous manners or empty threats. The doctor's steady gaze and collected demeanor completely unman the usually fearsome captain, forcing him to quiet down, revealing that underneath all the bluster and menace, there's a flicker of fear. This momentary surrender, this glimpse of vulnerability, makes you wonder even more about the captain's past. Why is a man so outwardly fearsome, so easily brought low by a polite yet firm doctor? What hidden depths does this man carry? It certainly isn't scurvy, which surprisingly few people got on short voyages, because their diet wasn't quite as restrictive as on long ones. Anyway, shortly after this confrontation, one cold, gray morning, a shadowy figure finally arrives at the Admiral Benbow. Black Dog, he's a pale, two-fingered fellow, equally sinister, and clearly no friend. This encounter is quick and violent. Black Dog finds the captain at the bar, and you hear snatches of hissed accusations and veiled threats, your heart pounding like a drum in your chest. "Black Spot," he spits, and then the sound of a struggle erupts, punctuated by the clash of steel. It's all a blur of violence that ends with Black Dog fleeing the inn with a cut on his arm, and Captain Bones collapsing, bloodied and pale. It's clear to you that the captain's past has just walked right through the door and planted itself firmly in your relatively boring inn. Historians still debate whether Black Spot was a universal pirate warning or a dramatic flourish invented by Stevenson, but its impact is undeniably chilling, turning a simple tavern into the very epicenter of a high-seas drama about to unfold. That clanging, that thud, that silent, terrified moment after Black Dog fled, leaving Captain Bones collapsed on the floor, your heart, as Jim hammered against your ribs like a trapped bird. You've just witnessed something out of a pulp fiction novel playing out in your respectable, if a little sleepy, family inn. Your mother, ever practical but visibly shaken, rushed to the captain's side while you hovered, unsure whether to fetch water or a bucket to clean up. The silence after the immediate violence felt heavier than the rum-soaked air, thick with unspoken dread. Soon enough, the good Dr. Livesey arrived, summoned swiftly. With a professional calm that contrasted sharply with the chaotic drama, he examined Captain Bones. He delivered the verdict with the precision of a seasoned detective, a stroke, likely brought on by an unhealthy mix of fear, exertion, and enough rum to pickle a whale. The captain, a man who scoffed at polite society, was now laid low by his own excesses. The doctor warned him, "One more glass of rum, Captain, and you'll be joining Davy Jones's locker for good." He was stern, not just offering medical advice, but delivering a prophecy. It was like watching someone stubbornly download a corrupted file over and over again, despite getting a critical error message each time. Eventually, the system just crashes. But the captain, though weakened, still had fight left. He mumbled about rum and even pleaded with you for a glass, a look of desperation in his usually stony eyes. It was a stark reminder that even the fiercest of individuals can be brought to their knees by their own demons. You remember looking at his massive tattooed arms, once capable of wielding a cutlass with deadly precision, now trembling uncontrollably, and felt a strange pang of pity. It was a human moment, briefly cutting through the pirate veneer. You did, in fact, bring him some water and help him back to his bed, watching him fall into a fitful, haunted sleep, muttering about Flint and the black spot. It struck you, perhaps for the first time, how deeply unsettling his past must be to haunt even his unconscious moments. You tried to soothe his brow, which was like trying to smooth the waves of a rough sea. Good luck with that, kid. A few days passed, tense and quiet. The captain seemed to recover somewhat, though still fragile, like an ancient ship patched up with hope and prayer, but clearly taking on water. Then, like a chill wind whistling through a crack in the door, another visitor arrived. This was even worse than Black Dog. It was Pew, a blind man, tapping his way menacingly along the road with his stick. He was a terrifying sight, even though you knew he couldn't see you. He was like a walking jump scare in a classic horror movie. Pew demanded to be led to the captain. His sightless eyes seemed to bore into your very soul, even as he gripped your arm with surprising strength. The scent of him was thick, a sour mix of stale ale, dirt, and desperation. He was more unnerving than a hungry wolf with a tax bill. He forced his way to Bones, his voice a low, raspy hiss as he thrust something into the captain's hand. It was another black spot. This wasn't a physical wound like the one Black Dog received, but a death sentence, delivered on a small, round piece of paper torn from a hymn book, blackened on one side, carrying the horrifying word, Varna, a distorted version of warning. On the other, this traditional pirate summons or death warrant, while famously dramatized by Stevenson, may have had some basis in real pirate lore, serving as a symbolic warning that time was running out, or as a notice of deposition, which is just a fancy way of saying, you're fired, but in a very final, non-HR approved way. The shock was too much for the already ailing captain. With a strangled cry, Billy Bones thrashed once, then lay still. He was dead. You stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the motionless figure of the old pirate who had so completely disrupted your life. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. A chill that had nothing to do with the outside weather went straight to your bones, pun intended. Relief mingled with a profound sense of shock. He was gone. The threat he embodied was gone, but the immediate consequence of his strange life and death was about to engulf you completely. This moment is so important in storytelling, where the inciting incident is paid off with the central conflict of the plot, not unlike a super awkward family dinner when your weird uncle finally spills the tea about the family treasure. Your mother, ever pragmatic, however, quickly understood the gravity of their situation. Dead men might tell no tales, but their belongings could certainly tell a compelling and often profitable one. Billy Bones owed the inn a hefty sum for his long stay, and there was also the clear and present danger that the blind Pew and his cronies might return to ransack the place in search of what the captain guarded so fiercely. So, driven by a desperate combination of practical debt collection and self-preservation, your mother decided, the sea chest. She had been right to worry. From your hiding spot behind the curtain, a particularly brave or perhaps foolish decision on your part. You hear a muffled tapping. The blind man's stick on the cobbles outside. "They're coming back," your mother hissed, her face pale. You helped her haul the massive sea chest into the middle of the room, a surprisingly easy feat for the both of you. Spurred by adrenaline and desperation, the chest was old, heavy, and smelled of salt and distant voyages. Historians still debate the exact dimensions of typical pirate chests. Some suggest they were more like communal lockers rather than individual treasure troves as popularized in fiction. But this one certainly felt like it contained untold secrets. You rattled the small bundle of keys found in the captain's pocket. They chimed against each other, a surprisingly melodic sound for the chaos it unleashed. Which one, though? It felt like trying to find the correct tiny USB-C adapter in a pile of obsolete tech. Finally, one key slid smoothly into the lock. With a resounding click and a groan of ancient hinges, the lid creaked open. Inside, it was a fascinating mix of the mundane and the mysterious. You saw clean shirts, neatly folded, suggesting a side of the captain that liked a modicum of order despite his rowdy exterior. There were strange, old instruments that probably measured latitude and longitude, or perhaps where he'd hidden his snacks from the crew. But most importantly, there was a heavy bag of coins, more gold and silver than you'd ever seen, dazzling under the flickering in-light, enough to cover his bill several times over, and perhaps even make your mother swoon, briefly forgetting the pirates. And then there was the oilskin packet, tucked right at the bottom, carefully wrapped and waterproofed, a small, yet immensely significant package. This was clearly the object of his intense paranoia. As your mother frantically counted out the owed money, suddenly a chilling whistle pierced the night air. It was a signal. You grabbed the oilskin packet without thinking, instinctively understanding its true importance. Outside, the sounds of approaching feet. The rough voices of men on the hunt grew louder. You had seconds. You both dashed out the back door just as the inn's main entrance splintered inwards. They were there. The pirates, led by Pew, who strangely still seemed to see his way around in the dark. It's an odd fact that, historically, some blind individuals developed heightened senses of hearing and touch that could astound the sighted, but Pew's menacing sixth sense seemed purely supernatural. You heard them tearing the inn apart behind you, shouting, cursing, ransacking everything in their desperate search. You scrambled over fences and ditches, the damp earth cold and hard under your feet, the night air sharp with fear. The precious oilskin packet clutched tight in your hand. You were out, but only just. The real adventure, it seemed, was just beginning, and it started not with a bang, but with a blind man's cane, tapping closer and closer to your very doorstep. Panting, your legs burning, you barely registered the chill of the night air as you and your mother scrambled through the tangled hedges and across muddy fields. The shouts of the pirates behind you, their frustrated curses echoing as they tore apart your home, spurred you on with primal urgency. The adrenaline that surged through you was a strange brew of terror and, bizarrely, exhilaration. You'd never been truly hunted before, not by men whose faces were etched with greed and violence, men who wouldn't think twice about putting a rusty cutlass through your chest. Your normal life, full of predictable chores and mild worries about soggy laundry, seemed like a dream. You burst into the village, breathless and disheveled, shouting about pirates and dead men. Your mother, despite her fear, managed to relay a somewhat coherent, though fragmented tale of their ordeal to the stunned villagers and the revenue officers who, after a suspiciously long delay, finally decided to take the matter seriously. These revenue men, charged with preventing smuggling, were notoriously slow to respond to actual crime, often seen as glorified tax collectors rather than a rapid response unit. Honestly, if this were modern day, you'd probably have a call the police button on your phone. But back then, you relied on the local constabulary, or in this case, customs officers, who seemed more interested in preserving their night's quiet than confronting actual danger. It's like waiting for technical support. You know they're coming. But when? Eventually, you and your mother made it to a neighbor's house, shaking but safe, the crumpled oilskin packet still clutched tightly in your hand. The air in the neighbor's kitchen smelled of warmth and comforting fear, which, strangely, felt a little like the comforting smell of clean socks that haven't quite dried in front of a roaring fire. Your mother was fussing, trying to make sense of what just happened, her hands trembling as she wiped imaginary dust from her apron. But your attention, even with the terror of the chase still tingling in your nerves, was solely focused on the mysterious package. The very next morning, once the immediate panic subsided and some semblance of safety returned, though your inn was still a wreck, Dr. Livesey arrived, followed shortly by Squire Trelawney. Dr. Livesey was, as always, the picture of collected wisdom and calm professionalism, perhaps even a touch of amusement at the whole madcap affair. Squire Trelawney, on the other hand, was the quintessential country gentleman, boisterous, well-meaning, prone to fits of grand pronouncements, and completely unsuited for clandestine affairs. He looked like someone who'd ordered an army from a catalogue, forgetting it still needed to be trained. His ruddy cheeks were flushed with a mix of excitement and indignation at the recent pirate unpleasantness. You laid the oilskin packet on the table, feeling the weight of anticipation. It wasn't just paper, it was potential. It contained a locked journal, which contained lists of names and dates, clearly Captain Bones's personal ledger, and an intriguing collection of small parcels that, when unwrapped, turned out to contain pieces of 8. Real ones, the kind you'd only read about in stories, with distinct engravings that dated them back to various Spanish colonial mints, confirming their authenticity. These were real historical currency, not some novelty coin you'd find at a gift shop. And then, at the very bottom, beneath everything else, lay the map. As you unrolled it, you felt an almost electric current pass through the room. It was old, certainly, covered in fine spiderwebs of cracks where the parchment had been folded repeatedly. It reeked of damp storage and salty air, with a hint of something faintly metallic, like rust, perhaps from the blood or grime of previous owners. But it was no ordinary map. This was the legendary treasure map of Captain Flint. Flint, for those who don't know, was perhaps the most fearsome and cruel pirate to ever sail the Spanish Main, though it is still debated whether he was a completely fictional character or based loosely on several infamous real pirates like Blackbeard or Henry Morgan. The map, hand-drawn with faded inks, showed an island, vaguely sketched with coastlines that seemed to pulse with unspoken secrets, along with cryptic navigational notes, soundings, and, most thrillingly, 3 red crosses. Here was scrawled beside one cross, indicating the primary hoard, and below it, in faded black ink, "Bulk of treasure here." The precise markings made it almost seem too good to be true, like a particularly generous fortune cookie that also contained exact coordinates. The moment Dr. Livesey, with his quiet intensity, leaned closer, his brow furrowed in concentration, the entire atmosphere shifted. He, with his sharp analytical mind, was captivated by the scientific and logistical details, seeing not just the X, but the careful charting and potential dangers. Squire Trelawney, on the other hand, was instantly aflame with a boyish zeal. He puffed out his chest, declaring immediately that they must get a ship and set sail without delay. "By thunder, Livesey!" he bellowed, his voice practically rattling the teacups. "We'll hire a schooner and recruit the bravest crew. We'll be back richer men." He started plotting the expedition then and there, naming names, devising plans for recruitment, and essentially drawing up an itinerary for an instant riches-gathering trip, all before consulting a single expert on anything maritime. He's that friend who immediately creates a shared document for planning a trip to Mars before even booking a flight to the next city. Dr. Livesey, ever the voice of reason, though clearly also excited, urged caution. "Squire," he began. "Discretion, my dear sir, discretion. This is dangerous business. The secret of this map must be kept, absolutely, beyond all suspicion." And this, of course, was exactly where Trelawney proved to be his own worst enemy. The doctor, being a professional, knew that such news could be like wildfire in a gunpowder keg. But the squire was a blabbermouth of epic proportions. You could practically hear the thoughts racing through his head. Oh, a secret, a pirate secret. Must tell everyone, but quietly, very, very quietly. Probably at the pub later. It was an odd fact that during the golden age of piracy, discretion was paramount not just for keeping secrets, but for avoiding swift and brutal punishment by authorities, as pirates were typically hanged immediately upon capture, often without trial. There was a specific pirate code, or articles, that often stipulated what actions were punishable by marooning or death, one of which was sharing too much information. As the two men discussed the immediate next steps, their voices becoming more hushed and serious, "You, Jim, absorbed it all. You watched the doctor trace lines on the map with a knowing finger, perhaps mentally calculating courses and supply needs. You saw the squire's eyes gleam with adventure and the promise of untold wealth. You realized that this simple piece of parchment, once just a discarded bit of trash from a dead pirate's chest, had now fundamentally altered the trajectory of your life. It wasn't just gold and jewels they were talking about. It was an escape from the predictable, a dive into the unknown, the prospect of actual adventure, the smell of salt spray on your face instead of dusty floors, the chance to be part of something legendary surged through you. You'd stumbled not just onto a map, but onto a literal key to unlocking a future you'd only dared to dream about. In your quieter moments, rocking slowly into a slumber after a busy day at the inn, now very much awake to the possibility of cannon fire and the roar of the sea. From the moment the decision was made, things moved with an almost unsettling speed. The dusty tranquility of the Admiral Benbow Inn, still echoing with the ghostly whispers of Billy Bones and the shattered aftermath of the pirates' raid, was traded for the bustling, raucous energy of Bristol. You felt it instantly, the cacophony of a working port city. The air, heavy and alive, assaulted your senses. A pungent cocktail of fish guts, wet ropes, tar and unwashed sailors, the clang of hammers, the rhythmic creak of ship timbers, the shouting of dock workers, and the omnipresent cry of gulls. It was an overwhelming symphony compared to your quiet village, like suddenly turning your low-fidelity antique radio into a surround sound theater. This was the true taste of adventure, the sensory equivalent of a really strong espresso after a week of lukewarm tea. Squire Trelawney, bless his enthusiastic heart, had promised discretion, and bless his cotton socks, he kept that promise about as well as a sieve holds water. Within a day of arriving in Bristol, it seemed every tavern keeper, every wharf rat, and every merchant knew that the squire was outfitting a ship, the Hispaniola, for a secret treasure hunt led by none other than the legendary Captain Flint's map. He couldn't resist a bit of pomp and circumstance, talking as if he were orchestrating a theatrical masterpiece rather than a perilous voyage. It was less of a clandestine operation and more of a publicly funded treasure reality TV show, except with far more potential for gruesome death. You had to suppress an eye roll, because, really, this was how you keep a secret? He was like that person who sends you a text that says, "Secret, do not tell anyone." Read by everyone who just scrolled past your screen. Yet despite his flamboyant indiscretion, the squire, in his characteristic blend of naivete and boundless optimism, managed to acquire a splendid schooner. The Hispaniola was sleek, fast, and powerfully rigged, her lines suggesting speed and a seaworthiness that calmed some of the fears nagging at the edges of your mind. She cut a fine figure at her moorings, masts pointing to the sky like fingers pointing at the promise of a golden horizon. The squire also enlisted a stern but seemingly competent captain named Smollett, and a collection of well-regarded sailors he'd vetted, at least initially. Everything seemed to be falling into place, a testament to Trelawney's resources, if not his cunning. Your attention, however, was quickly drawn to another pivotal character. It was in one of Bristol's more notorious taverns, a dimly lit smoky establishment called the Spyglass, that you first encountered him, Long John Silver. He stood behind the counter, a formidable figure with a jovial face, an impeccably clean white apron, and, as fate would have it, one leg. Your heart skipped a beat, recalling the captain's dread-filled warnings about a one-legged man. But Silver's initial impression was so disarmingly charming, so unlike the menacing specters of Bones's nightmares, that your alarm bells temporarily fell silent. He seemed, in every aspect, the picture of a respectable, successful innkeeper. He exuded an almost irresistible warmth and friendliness, with a voice that was both booming and smooth, like rich, dark rum. He carried a parrot, Captain Flint, on his shoulder, which shrieked, "Pieces of 8! Pieces of 8!" at opportune or sometimes entirely inconvenient moments. It's an odd fact that some historical pirates did keep exotic pets like parrots, which they acquired on their travels through the Caribbean, serving as companions on long voyages or as novelties to sell. This particular avian companion, however, felt more like a mischievous confidant than a simple pet. Silver was immediately the talk of the dock. The squire introduced him with grand gestures, praising his long career as a sea cook despite his missing leg, which Silver readily explained was lost in the service of the king. "A true patriot, I assure you," Squire Trelawney beamed, as if presenting a medal recipient rather than a newly hired crewman. And then came the revelation that Silver, seemingly by happy coincidence, had an extensive network of old seafaring acquaintances and was remarkably efficient at recruiting a strong crew, the best men, he swore, men who knew the ropes and were eager for a grand adventure. His smooth talk, his quick wit, and the way he commanded the attention of everyone around him made him instantly popular. Even the crusty dockworkers seemed to defer to him. Yet, a subtle disquiet began to form within you, an almost subconscious itch that you couldn't quite scratch. It wasn't anything Silver said directly, but rather the way he said it, or the brief, almost imperceptible flicker in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. And then there were the men he brought aboard, a rough, shifty-looking bunch. They weren't like the upstanding, seasoned sailors you'd imagined joining such an important expedition. Many looked a little too eager for adventure, their eyes glinting with a mercenary sheen. Dr. Livesey, ever observant, also noticed this. He expressed his concerns to the squire and the captain. "Squire," he began, his voice low and serious, "these men, they are not the typical seamen I'd wish to sail with. There's a hardness in their eyes, a familiarity with violence that goes beyond a rough exterior." He was like a keen medical diagnostician, spotting the telltale signs of disease before any major symptoms appeared. Captain Smollett, the ship's appointed master, too, grew uneasy. He, a seasoned professional, had misgivings about the composition of his crew and the indiscreet talk surrounding the voyage. He pulled the squire and doctor aside, voicing his grave reservations, though not directly mentioning Silver. "Sir," he stated, his voice flat, "I don't like the crews, I don't like the men, and I don't like my officer. That is to say, I do not like the position we are in." He didn't quite understand the specific threat yet, but his sailor's intuition screamed trouble. He, unlike the optimistic squire, saw the immediate implications of too many eager faces and too little experience. For generations, actual naval captains and shipping masters knew the character of a crew could make or break a voyage. It is historically debated whether a truly effective pirate spy network existed within port towns, actively infiltrating legitimate ships, or if the recruitment process simply naturally drew adventurous and less scrupulous men. Either way, Silver seemed to have a supernatural knack for finding the exact wrong people. But Trelawney, utterly blinded by his own romantic vision of the quest and his unshakable belief in Silver's character, dismissed their fears. He called Smollett a grumbling stick of a fellow, and Livesey a man who found danger where none exists. He laughed off the doctor's cautions about keeping the secret, saying everyone on the dock is a man of honor, bless their souls, as if honorable pirates were a common occurrence, like finding a perfectly symmetrical cloud. The captain of a real pirate vessel would enforce strict loyalty among his crew through fear and occasional brutal discipline. You could hardly imagine such strict codes of conduct on a vessel assembled by an innocent aristocrat. You watched as the last provisions were loaded, the deck bustling with new faces, and an ominous sense of foreboding, like the quiet before a squall, settled in your stomach. The Hispaniola was ready to sail, and a ship packed with secrets, uneasy officers, and a charming, one-legged cook, whose geniality felt almost too perfect, seemed destined for a very uncomfortable journey. You had a bad feeling about this, a gut instinct that was screaming at you, far louder than the annoying parrot ever could. The Hispaniola finally cast off her moorings with a quiet thud and the splash of anchor chain. You stood at the railing, feeling the thrilling rise and fall of the deck beneath your feet as she picked up speed. The smells of the harbor, with its blend of industry and fish, slowly gave way to the clean, bracing scent of the open sea. It was a dizzying sensation, like riding a particularly large and gentle beast, but one that could, and often did, buck you right off if you weren't paying attention. The initial excitement was palpable. New sights, new sounds, the boundless horizon stretching before you like a freshly cleaned sheet of blue paper. Captain Smollett, the gruff but competent ship's master, set the course, and the sails, billowed full with the wind, sent you speeding toward the southwest. For the first few days, life aboard the Hispaniola settled into a predictable rhythm of chores, watch shifts, and shared meals. Despite Captain Smollett's grumbling, which was mostly confined to hushed conversations with Dr. Livesey and Squire Trelawney, the voyage seemed smooth. Silver, true to his amiable persona, was everywhere. He hobbled around on his crutch with remarkable agility, supervising the galley, chatting with the men, and occasionally indulging in good-natured banter with you, Jim. His parrot, Captain Flint, squawked its perpetual "pieces of 8" refrain, providing a sort of raucous, feathered background music. He truly seemed the perfect ship's cook, his missing leg adding to his sea dog mystique, rather than detracting from it. You watched him expertly prepare meals, his single arm managing the various pots and pans with impressive dexterity, the savory smells of ship's fare drifting invitingly through the air. You couldn't help but notice, however, that even as he jested, his eyes seemed to constantly be observing, taking stock, like a seasoned card sharp subtly analyzing the whole table, which felt vaguely unsettling in hindsight, like someone being too good at chess for just a cook. One evening, after a particularly warm and breezy day that had made you feel deliciously sleepy, you decided you wanted an apple. The Hispaniola was carrying a large supply of them for the journey, kept fresh in barrels lashed to the deck for good ventilation, though one barrel, larger than the others, served as a makeshift storage unit in a slightly sheltered part of the ship. You crept towards the spot where the provisions were kept, thinking you'd just grab one and head back to your bunk for an early night. The rocking of the ship, the gentle lapping of waves against the hull, and the comforting creak of the timbers were incredibly soothing. The air within the barrel smelled sweet and earthy, like an orchard after a gentle rain. You squeezed inside the large barrel, reaching for the juiciest apple, and finding it surprisingly comfortable. One might even describe it as snug, maybe a bit too snug for someone contemplating a proper nap after all that bracing sea air, but comfortable enough if you wanted to listen to everything going on around you, and wouldn't you know it, with the natural laziness of youth, you drifted off, tucked amongst the fruity delights. You woke abruptly to the low rumble of voices, distinct from the ambient ship noise just outside your wooden cocoon. They were loud enough to be clearly understood, but hushed enough to suggest a secretive nature. It was too dark inside your impromptu sleeping chamber to tell exactly who was speaking, but the familiar lilt of one particular voice sent a cold jolt of apprehension through your chest. Long John Silver. He was accompanied by 2 others. You recognized the distinct raspy tones of Israel Hands, the ship's coxswain, and another man named Dick Johnson, a new recruit who seemed a little too eager for action. Their words were fragments at first, but soon, horrifyingly, the complete picture began to coalesce in your mind. Silver was outlining his grand design with a chilling nonchalance. He wasn't merely the cook, he was the clandestine ringleader, a seasoned pirate, orchestrating a complex scheme that had been brewing long before they even left Bristol. "Here's the plan, boys," Silver was saying, his voice as smooth as polished mahogany, but with an underlying steel that you now, in hindsight, realized had always been present. "We let the squire and the doctor do the dirty work, dig up old Flint's cache. They bust their backs, they fill the chests, they drag it down to the boat. Then, and only then, do we show 'em what we're made of." He punctuated this with a gruesome chuckle. He described with unsettling clarity how, once the treasure was found and safely aboard the Hispaniola, they would kill off the loyal crew. Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey, Captain Smollett, and any men still loyal to them, and claim the ship and the vast fortune for themselves. It was an audacious and brutal plot, designed to extract the maximum benefit from their unwitting patrons before discarding them like unwanted trash. The cold efficiency of his words sent a shiver down your spine. This wasn't some romantic notion of pirates. This was cold, calculated murder. Historians still debate the specific honor among thieves aspect of pirate codes. While pirates did often elect their captains and share plunder, brutal betrayal of non-pirates and even fellow pirates was far from uncommon when large fortunes were at stake. Silver explained his manipulative tactics, how he had carefully selected his confederates, using the squire's indiscretion to his advantage, making sure every hand he recruited was an old salt from Flint's former crew or a sympathetic rogue. He scoffed at the gullibility of gentlemen like the squire, who, despite their wealth, seemed utterly devoid of common sense when it came to reading men. "Trustin' us like we were babes, they did," Silver chuckled. "Never once looked a man in the eye who didn't want 'em dead." He also revealed that they'd already killed a loyal sailor who suspected them earlier in the voyage. It's an odd fact that during voyages, fresh produce like apples, when stored improperly in closed environments, could produce ethylene gas, leading to faster spoilage of other nearby goods, a fact completely irrelevant to your imminent doom, but a fun tidbit nonetheless. Your heart pounded so hard you felt sure they could hear it drumming against the wooden slats of the barrel. Every word, every conspiratorial whisper, etched itself onto your mind, a terrifying revelation that flipped your world upside down. The jovial cook, the friendly, one-legged man with the parrot. He was a cunning, merciless killer. A wolf in sheep's clothing. This was no bedtime story pirate. This was a truly dangerous individual. It suddenly made sense why Captain Smollett had seemed so worried, and why Dr. Livesey had insisted on caution. They had sensed the lurking danger, but not the sheer scale of the treachery. You wished you had told someone that the guy Captain Bones warned about, the one-legged guy, was now cooking their dinner. Just a little late on that intel, aren't we, Jim? You heard the shuffle of feet, and then the quiet voice of Israel Hands. But Silver, what about them ashore? The ones who went with the squire to get supplies. Are we letting them off easy? Silver simply snorted. "Oh no, matey. A dead man tells no tales, and if any of them comes back, they'll wish they hadn't." He outlined their ultimate destination, the anchorage where the treasure lay, describing the various coves and landmarks. Their discussion drifted to the layout of the island and the optimal timing for the mutiny. You realized that this was a well-thought-out plan, rehearsed and ready to spring at the first opportunity. The sense of vulnerability inside that barrel was immense. A stray cough, a sudden shift, and your hiding place could be revealed, spelling immediate doom. The phrase, historians still debate whether all pirate crews meticulously planned every aspect of their mutinies, or if many were spontaneous acts of desperation and greed, floated vaguely through your fear-addled mind. But clearly, Silver's version was definitely the meticulous kind. The voices eventually faded as the men dispersed, leaving you alone in the darkness of the apple barrel, trembling from the cold realization of your peril. The innocent apples now seemed sinister, silent witnesses to a deadly secret. You needed to act, and fast. But first, you needed to compose yourself. Carefully, ever so slowly, you pushed aside the lid, emerging from the barrel like a creature from a shadowy cave. The ship still creaked around you, the waves still lapped gently, but the comforting sounds of the voyage now seemed laden with malice. The journey that had begun as a grand adventure was now a ticking clock, and you, young Jim Hawkins, were suddenly a spy, caught between the cunning designs of mutinous pirates and the trusting ignorance of your benefactors, holding knowledge that could save or condemn them all. You crept from the apple barrel, the salt spray on your face, suddenly feeling cold and alarming instead of invigorating. Your mind reeled, a jumble of Long John Silver's casual villainy, the names of his conspirators, and the chilling detail about waiting for the treasure to be dug before slicing throats. It was like suddenly realizing your friendly fluffy dog was, in fact, a particularly convincing wolf in a very effective disguise and had just booked an exterminator for your entire family. The innocent creak of the ship's timbers, the gentle lapping of waves against the hull, it all seemed to carry a sinister undertone now. Your first impulse was to run to Captain Smollett, Dr. Livesey, and Squire Trelawney to spill the terrible secret you'd just unwittingly scooped up. You found them all huddled in the captain's cabin, likely discussing something mundane about supplies or the precise degree of an upcoming turn. You burst in, breathless and wide-eyed, probably looking like you'd just seen a ghost, which, in a way, you had. The ghost of a happy voyage, now definitively murdered. You tried to stammer out the story, your words tumbling over each other in a frantic, urgent whisper. At first, the squire, always eager for a laugh, assumed you were playing some kind of boyish trick, or had perhaps simply indulged in too many apples. But Captain Smollett, whose practical experience had made him inherently suspicious of any hint of mischief, silenced him with a stern glance. Dr. Livesey, calm as ever, listened intently, his expression growing more grave with each word you spoke. When you recounted Silver's detailed plan, the way he calmly spoke of murder and betrayal, the silence in the cabin became heavy, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the ship. Their faces, once filled with casual conversation, turned ashen, especially Squire Trelawney's. He looked as if he'd just swallowed a whole lime. Historians still debate the efficiency of intelligence gathering aboard ships during this era. Some suggest that informal networks of gossip and suspicion were far more potent than any formal spy systems, and certainly your accidental eavesdropping was a prime example of information going truly off-book. The revelation of Long John Silver's mutinous intentions sent a shockwave through their small circle. Smollett immediately took command of the situation, his military background kicking in. No more dithering, no more romanticizing. This was war. "We have a handful of honest men," he stated, his voice tight with resolve. "The squire, Dr. Livesey, Abraham Gray, a few loyal seamen, and young Hawkins. The rest are rogues, likely to turn against us when the time is ripe." He wasted no time railing against Trelawney's earlier folly, choosing to focus on immediate strategy. It's an odd fact that scurvy, a common affliction among sailors, often affected one's emotional state, causing irritability and depression. But Smollett was all business, no sign of emotional breakdown, thankfully. Just as the cold dread of mutiny was fully sinking in, the lookout's call rang down from the mast. "Land ho! Treasure Island!" A wave of strange relief mixed with fresh apprehension washed over you. The destination was in sight, but now it held a terrible new meaning. The island, emerging from the hazy distance, looked vaguely green and rugged, with a distinctive peak known as Spyglass Hill, named for obvious reasons, like if someone used it to spy, I guess. The shore was fringed with dense jungle, a forbidding barrier of vibrant, tangled greens, punctuated by rocky outcrops. It looked exactly like a movie poster for Desert Island of Death and Despair. Captain Smollett quickly devised a clever plan. He knew that open confrontation before they even landed would likely be disastrous, as the loyal crew were heavily outnumbered by Silver's faction. His idea was simple: feign a good mood, tell the crew they could go ashore for recreation after such a long voyage, let them stretch their sea legs and explore. This would achieve two things. It would get the mutinous elements off the ship and onto the island, giving the Loyalists a better chance to defend the Hispaniola if needed, or to find a more defensible position on land, and it would appeal directly to the pirates' impatience and eagerness, making them temporarily drop their guard. It was a cunning tactical decision, sacrificing the immediate satisfaction of revenge for the strategic advantage. It felt a bit like tricking your incredibly strong, potentially violent cat into a cat carrier by leaving treats inside, Once they're in, it's a new game entirely. True to the plan, Silver, with his infectious good cheer, organized the shore parties. The men were bursting with excitement at the prospect of stepping on solid ground, running wild and hunting treasure, even though they probably meant hunting anything not nailed down. Many grabbed muskets and cutlasses, ostensibly for protection from unknown island dangers, but really just itching for a fight. Seeing the rest of the hands pile into the ship's 2 boats, eager as schoolboys on holiday, a desperate yearning for the solidity of land seized you, too. And in a rash, impulsive decision, you hopped into the first boat. You wanted to be part of the landing, to feel the earth again, and perhaps to gain a better sense of the dangers that now surrounded them, a sort of real-time reconnaissance. It was a bad decision, in retrospect, like deciding to just pop down to the grocery store in a zombie apocalypse. The moment your foot hit the coarse, damp sand of the island, a blast of hot, humid air washed over you, thick with the scent of unfamiliar jungle flora and rich, earthy soil. You felt the oppressive humidity cling to your skin and dampen your clothes. This was not the quaint English countryside. This was something wild and untamed, already pulsing with unspoken dangers, not just from men, but from the very environment itself. The shore party quickly splintered. Silver, with about half a dozen of his confederates, including Dick Johnson, set off in one direction, while others fanned out, disappearing into the dense undergrowth, already shouting and hollering with a sense of ill-gotten freedom. Silver's hearty laugh echoed through the trees, a chilling sound in this new alien environment. He looked over at you, still with that fake, disarming smile. "Keep a good eye on young Jim here," he said to the man nearest him. "He's a sharp lad, this one." "Gee, and you knew he was just telling this other fellow to keep an eye on you so that you didn't betray their little secrets." Suddenly, 2 shots cracked through the steamy air from a distance, then a third, and then a yell, a horrifying, piercing cry. You knew at once it was a human sound, and a man was screaming for his life. The initial, thrilling energy of the landing shattered into pure, icy fear. Long John Silver froze, his jovial mask falling away to reveal a face hard and grim, his true nature finally revealed. "By the living thunder, mates!" he snarled, dropping all pretense of affability. "Flint himself! They've jumped a mate!" He hobbled swiftly towards the sounds of the gunfire, signaling his loyalists to follow him deeper into the jungle, transforming from pleasant cook to murderous pirate captain in the blink of an eye. This sudden switch was less like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and more like a gentle puppy, suddenly sprouting fangs and demanding to discuss blood contracts. Panic seized you. You realized how dangerously isolated you were. Alone, on this wild island with cutthroats whose loyalty had dissolved like sugar in hot tea. As the sounds of crashing undergrowth and increasingly desperate cries continued, followed by more shots, your instinct screamed, "Run!" You didn't stop to think. You bolted. You darted deeper into the thick, unfamiliar jungle, heedless of thorns or tangles. The jungle itself seemed to press in on you, hot and claustrophobic. You heard Silver's gruff commands echoing, the unmistakable thud-thud of his crutch in pursuit, though thankfully not directly behind you. You were running headlong, hoping simply to outpace the immediate danger. The shouts grew fainter, muffled by the oppressive canopy of trees, and your mind replayed Silver's casual description of the fate of a loyal man on the Hispaniola before you stumbled on the actual bloody evidence. You pushed aside a thick vine and came across a body. One of the men, perhaps even the sailor Israel Hands was talking about, lay dead, unmistakably killed by the pirates. Another victim, this one definitive, of Silver's merciless ambition. The earth around the body was disturbed, churned with footprints, but you couldn't stay. Your stomach churned. This was it. The adventure had gone from exciting to genuinely terrifying. This wasn't a game. Lives were being lost, and your own was now squarely in the crosshairs. You could hear faint sounds of chopping now, too, indicating the others were working on establishing some sort of base, not knowing their initial act of murder had confirmed all the warnings that your loyal party had heard. You needed to find safety, and quickly, before you became the next body discovered in this terrifying tropical paradise. Your legs ached as you burst through the undergrowth, leaving the dead sailor behind. The frantic beating of your heart against your ribs felt like a drumbeat urging you onward. The jungle, which minutes ago seemed merely an exotic backdrop, now felt like a suffocating green monster, all tangles and shadowy threats. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sounded like the approach of Long John Silver's crutch or the hiss of a cutlass being drawn. You were entirely, horrifyingly alone. Your childish impulse to join the shore party now seemed less an adventure and more like a spectacularly ill-conceived plan, right up there with using a fork in a toaster. You kept running, instinctively moving deeper inland, putting as much distance as possible between yourself and the bloody realities playing out on the beach. Meanwhile, back on the Hispaniola, Captain Smollett, Dr. Livesey, and even the now-sobered Squire Trelawney reacted swiftly to the sounds of gunfire and screams. They knew that their meager handful of loyal men were at a catastrophic disadvantage against Silver's large and armed contingent. To stay on the ship, surrounded by potentially hostile, idle hands, was a recipe for instant disaster. They had one advantage: the map and Smollett's quick, strategic mind. He remembered seeing a small cross marking a fort or a stockade on the old parchment. This wasn't just a random doodle. It was a relic from Flint's own time, likely a place he or his crew used to guard treasure before their deaths, perhaps a pre-existing structure he inherited from some forgotten colonial outpost or rival pirate. That made it defensible. "To the stockade!" Smollett bellowed, his voice sharp with command, instantly snapping everyone into action. Their immediate priority was not the treasure, but survival. They rapidly decided to abandon the Hispaniola for now, along with the bulk of their less-than-loyal crew, and fortify themselves on land. It was a risky gamble, as it left their transport vulnerable, but staying on the ship would be suicide. They quickly gathered crucial supplies, as many provisions as they could manage, an abundance of fresh water barrels, all their remaining arms, muskets, pistols, swords, and the all-important powder and shot. Dr. Livesey, always thinking practically, ensured their meager medical supplies were also among the first items to be loaded onto the longboat, along with a few precious bottles of the good stuff for pain or disinfection, which, honestly, would be primarily rum. The loyal crew, including the few brave seamen who remained staunchly by their side, like the trusty Abraham Gray, whose loyalty felt almost impossibly firm in a world of treachery, quickly prepared the small ship's boat. The frantic but orderly transfer of vital supplies was completed under intense psychological pressure, with every eye straining towards the shore, anticipating confrontation, wondering if Silver's men would rush back. This swift decision to retreat to a defensible land position, even while abandoning their vessel, was a critical maneuver, a tactical move far more advanced than run screaming, which is often one's first instinct when facing bloodthirsty pirates. Historically, naval strategy emphasized the importance of secure land-based fortifications for supplies and rest, a practice adopted even by privateers and pirates. Their journey to the stockade, though short, was tense. They rowed ashore, careful to keep their movements as quiet as possible, though the distinct sound of oars dipping into water on an otherwise still day was a gamble. You could imagine the tension of knowing you are racing against time, with murderous eyes watching. The spot Smollett chose from the map wasn't right on the beach, where the first men had landed and shots were fired. It was slightly further along the coast, a good tactical move for disembarking without drawing immediate fire. As they stepped onto the sandy shore, the humid air clung to them, and the sounds of the distant jungle, along with faint, wild shouts from the other shore party, pressed in. The stockade itself was exactly as marked on the map, a clearing in the jungle, surprisingly defensible, fortified by a sturdy palisade of thick, pointed logs. These were not quickly erected poles. They looked aged, partially covered in moss, indicating a forgotten, weathered stronghold. Inside, the most vital feature was a clear spring of fresh water, bubbling up from the earth, an absolute necessity for any extended stay, perhaps even more valuable than gold. Access to potable water for historical expeditions and fortresses alike was the single most crucial factor for long-term survival, because let's face it, without it, even a pirate can't really plot mischief after 2 days. They immediately began to prepare for the inevitable siege. This wasn't some gentle camping trip in the woods with s'mores and acoustic guitar. This was hardcore survival, more akin to an extreme-edged season of a reality survival show, only without the cameraman, and very much with sharp, pointy things coming at you. They set up lookouts, distributed weapons, and carefully stacked provisions inside the shelter of the wooden walls. Every loyal man, including Captain Smollett, Dr. Livesey, and Squire Trelawney, took a share of the laborious work, reinforcing weaker spots and preparing to hold their ground. The sound of wood splintering as they secured barricades and dug rifle slits punctuated the otherwise quiet air, a strangely industrial symphony in the middle of a primeval jungle. The tension, however, was as thick as the humidity. Every shadow seemed to harbor a hidden threat, every rustle of leaves a sign of impending attack. Soon enough, the mutineers began to gather on the beaches within sight of the Hispaniola. Their frustrated yells carried across the water. They were enraged, no doubt, that their unsuspecting prey had flown the coop, effectively leaving them stranded on an island with no ready access to the only means of escape. Silver, recognizing their move, started barking commands. They began loading a cannon from the Hispaniola onto one of the boats, a small swivel gun, mostly used for signaling or harassing smaller vessels, but in close quarters, potentially lethal. It felt like watching two highly dysfunctional football teams on opposing sidelines, trying to figure out how to score before the other team could call their own timeout. It was going to be an intense match, possibly resulting in permanent injuries. As darkness fell, deepening the shadows beneath the oppressive jungle canopy, the atmosphere inside the stockade grew heavier still. They settled into an anxious vigil, taking turns on watch, straining their ears for any sign of the pirates. The air hummed with unseen insects, their chirps forming a bizarrely soothing, but still unnerving lullaby. The Loyalists, however, found an ironic sort of relief in the solid ground beneath their feet and the sturdy walls around them. The sea, once their avenue to freedom, was now the pathway for their enemies. And what about Jim? You, still lost in the vastness of the island, heard the faint echoes of the cannon firing, the distant shouts. It wasn't just a signal now, it was a clear sign of conflict, confirming your worst fears about what had happened on the ship and between the two parties. The island, while providing a temporary respite from the mutineers directly around the ship, offered its own perils, unknown creatures rustling in the undergrowth, treacherous terrain, and of course, the ever-present threat of running directly into Silver's men. You stumbled on, fueled by adrenaline and the sheer terror of isolation. The exotic smells of the jungle, the sickly sweet odor of rotting fruit mixed with the damp earth and something distinctly metallic, like uncleaned knives, were all you had for company. The dense foliage, once beautiful and captivating, became a suffocating maze, and the very ground underfoot felt alien. You just wanted to find someone, anyone. You felt terribly small and insignificant on this vast, untamed island, truly the weakest link, yet holding critical information that now felt useless because you were trapped and separated. Historians still debate whether creating such a detailed, easily navigable treasure map for others to find was a typical pirate practice, given their paranoia about their hoard being discovered, or if it was simply a convenient plot device. Clearly for you, Jim, it was a terrible convenience, leading you to this lonely and precarious situation. You huddled beneath the sheltering roots of a colossal, ancient tree, trying to quiet the chattering of your teeth and the drumming of your heart, wondering if the darkness would bring safety or merely hide a more terrible end. the sounds of a strange, alien landscape, broken by the distant calls of frustrated pirates, served as your terrifying lullaby. The darkness of the jungle pressed in around you, heavy and thick, punctuated by the chirping symphony of unseen insects. You huddled miserably beneath the massive roots of a gnarled, ancient tree, trying to quiet your frantic thoughts and the insistent shivering that racked your small frame. The sounds of distant cannon fire, of shouting pirates, were now mercifully faded echoes, but the profound sense of isolation remained. Every snap of a twig made you jump. Every rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of terror through you. You'd probably make a terrible contestant on a jungle survival show, seeing as your first few hours involve running blindly from a one-legged chef. Sleep, when it eventually came, was fitful, filled with dreams of echoing pieces of 8, and the cold metallic glint of cutlasses. Dawn broke slowly, filtering through the dense canopy in hazy shafts of light that only partially alleviated the gloom. Your body ached, your mouth felt like sandpaper, and your stomach growled in protest. You desperately needed water, and, more importantly, a plan. Moving slowly, stiff from the cold damp, you started to navigate the unfamiliar terrain, trying to head towards any perceived high ground, hoping for a vantage point from which you could spot the ship, or, even better, the Loyalists' stockade. You chewed on a bitter, unfamiliar leaf, hoping it might offer some sustenance, but it just tasted like disappointment and tree sap. Hours melted into a hazy blur of walking, clambering over fallen logs, pushing through tangled vines that seemed determined to snag you at every turn. The oppressive humidity was draining, leaving you sticky and breathless. The island's wildlife, while largely unseen, made its presence known with unseen calls and the unsettling rustle of unseen creatures. It was easy to imagine enormous spiders lurking in the shadows, ready to ambush unsuspecting boys who had, arguably, much larger problems than arachnophobia at the moment. You stumbled on, your resolve wavering under the combined weight of fear and exhaustion, like trying to run a marathon after eating only stale crackers for a week. Then you saw him. A flash of something white, then a hunched figure moving through the undergrowth, far in the distance. Your heart leaped, instantly a prisoner of renewed terror. Pirates. It had to be. You froze, instinctively flattening yourself against the rough bark of a tree, holding your breath, trying to meld into the dense green. This was it. Caught. Done for. The mental debate raged, fight, hide, or make a break for it, and probably fall into a pit of quicksand, because, of course, that's next. But as the figure drew closer, you realized he didn't move like a pirate. His steps were hesitant, almost erratic, and he seemed to talk to himself, or perhaps to invisible companions. His clothing, what was left of it, was ragged and patched, resembling more tattered sailcloth than any discernible outfit. His hair and beard were long and matted, encrusted with what looked like salt and mud, his skin tanned to the color of old leather. When he finally emerged into a sliver of sunlight, you saw his eyes, wide, frantic, and staring, as if perpetually seeing something just beyond the horizon that no one else could perceive. This wasn't a pirate. This was something else entirely. This was a man utterly alone, almost wild, like a forgotten garden gnome suddenly coming to life and having a very bad day. You cautiously stepped out. He looked at you, startled, his eyes widening further in disbelief. "Who are you, matey?" he croaked, his voice raspy as though unused to human speech. "Are you spirits? Are you angels? Are you the fella from the bread truck with the cheesy rolls?" And that's how you met Ben Gunn. He was utterly ecstatic to see another human face, a state of hyper-excitement that verged on the unnerving. He immediately wanted to know if you had any cheese. His singular, all-consuming craving for cheese after years of island fare was strangely touching and a bit pathetic. It's an odd fact that dietary deficiencies can cause peculiar cravings, like geophagy, eating dirt, but wanting cheddar that badly usually points to nothing more than simple preference. You realized you didn't have cheese, only bitter leaves and lingering fear, and you felt an immediate sympathy. Ben Gunn, it turned out, had been marooned on Treasure Island for 3 long years. 3 years. Imagine being stuck on an island with no Netflix, no pizza delivery, no complaining on social media, just leaves. It sounds like a bad retreat designed by an overzealous life coach. His story spilled out in a torrent of agitated words, interrupted by frantic glances into the surrounding jungle, as if unseen entities were listening. He'd been part of Captain Flint's crew, yes, but after Flint had buried his immense hoard, Ben had returned years later with another ship, persuading his shipmates that he knew exactly where the treasure was hidden. He was, effectively, a very confident but very bad navigator, or perhaps an even worse salesperson. His promise to find the treasure quickly had been, shall we say, a significant overestimation. For 12 miserable days they searched, growing increasingly desperate. When they failed to find it, his shipmates, infuriated by his false promises and probably by their growing thirst, abandoned him. Maroning, leaving a sailor alone on a deserted island with perhaps a musket, some powder and water, if they were lucky, was a surprisingly common punishment in the golden age of piracy, usually for serious infractions like theft, desertion, or mutiny against a fellow pirate. It was considered worse than death by many, a slow, torturous fade from humanity. Historians still debate the frequency of marooning as a practice. Some sources suggest it was far less common than fictional portrayals imply, given its psychological toll and lack of practicality for immediate punishment. But for Ben Gunn, it was brutally real. His isolation had warped him, certainly. He twitched, mumbled, and seemed perpetually startled by loud noises or sudden movements, like a house cat after an unexpected thunderclap. He talked about meat, glorious meat, about how he survived on goats, berries, and some local shellfish. He explained that his constant yearning for cheese wasn't just a hunger. It was a deep, psychological longing, a memory of a time when the world was structured and civilized, a comfort from a forgotten home. He recounted his attempts to build a small boat, or coracle, a feat of incredible perseverance, given his dwindling sanity and lack of proper tools, using the hides of the wild goats he hunted. Then came the astonishing revelation. "Aye," Ben croaked, his eyes darting from side to side conspiratorially. 3-year come next October, and I ain't seen a Christian soul till you, young master, and during them years, I found something. I did." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, though his eyes still spun around. "Not Flint's, no, he hid it all. But what was it, boy? What was it he found, long after they marooned me?" He gestured vaguely. "It wasn't easy. Not where the map said. But I found it." He wasn't talking about Flint's main hoard, but another treasure. A treasure he had located and secretly extracted over his years of solitary suffering. He had meticulously worked away at it, relocating the vast majority of it to his own secure, secret cave system far from the traditional landing spots, an immense personal achievement only made possible by the incredible isolation of the island and the time on his hands. It's almost comical to think about a madman carefully orchestrating an enormous gold relocation project just to give himself a hobby while stranded. This secret was key. Ben Gunn's strange, rambling tale finally made sense. He explained that he'd been signaling Captain Smollett's party with a controlled fire to alert them to his presence on the island. He desperately wanted off, but he also, it quickly became clear, wanted a bargain. He promised his absolute loyalty to Squire Trelawney and Dr. Livesey if they would get him off the island safely. And in return, he'd reveal his secret. "You'll find I'm mighty rich indeed," he insisted, punctuating this with a crazy cackle that startled a flock of exotic birds. Your meeting with Ben Gunn was nothing short of miraculous. He was disheveled, mentally fractured by his long solitude, and more than a little eccentric. but he represented a glimmer of hope, a potential ally in a sea of treacherous pirates. You suddenly felt a surge of energy, a shift from a paralyzing fear to a newfound determination. This weird, cheese-obsessed wild man, more comfortable talking to goats than people, had the means to save you and your friends, even if he still seemed like he was constantly battling invisible gnats. You realized that this seemingly off-topic fact, a madman who found the treasure without a map, was, in fact, the key to everything. You now had an unexpected advantage, something even Long John Silver and his mutinous dogs didn't know. The irony was almost humorous. They were after one treasure, completely oblivious that a wild-eyed castaway had already found another, more important one, hiding it away like an antisocial squirrel hoarding its favorite nuts. Now, you just had to figure out how to reconnect with Smollett and Livesey without running straight into a waiting pirate cutlass. The meeting with Ben Gunn had jolted you, Jim, out of your fear paralysis, filling you with a renewed sense of purpose and, more importantly, a glimmer of hope. After exchanging promises, you'd help him get cheese, and he'd help you find a boat. He pointed you in the general direction of the stockade. Your weary legs found new strength as you plunged back into the oppressive humidity and tangles of the jungle, determined to get back to your friends. Hours later, guided by faint glimpses of cleared ground and the scent of wood smoke, you finally emerged, breathless, near the fortified compound. You hailed the sentry with a mixture of relief and raw exhaustion, nearly giving the poor chap a heart attack. You burst into the stockade, a chaotic mixture of a mud-caked apparition and an adrenaline-fueled informant. Captain Smollett and Dr. Livesey, initially relieved at your appearance, quickly became grave as you relayed your astonishing encounter with Ben Gunn, the tale of a marooned lunatic obsessed with cheese who just so happened to have stumbled upon Captain Flint's treasure himself, or rather a significant portion of it, sounded so improbable that it bordered on delusion. Yet your earnestness and the sheer, odd specificity of Ben's ramblings convinced them. Smollett, always practical, grasped the strategic significance of a separate, hidden treasure almost immediately, his brow furrowed in calculation. This peculiar alliance with an unhinged hermit was a completely unexpected wildcard, turning an almost hopeless situation into one with potential. Much like finding a fully stocked vending machine after trekking through the desert for 3 days. The atmosphere within the stockade was thick with anticipation. Captain Smollett, with the professionalism of a true military commander, had overseen the rapid fortification of their position. Inside the palisade, everyone worked silently, their faces grim. You helped too, bringing water barrels to the defensive slits, stacking spare ammunition, and peering through the rough gaps in the log wall, your ears straining for any sound from the dense jungle. The previous night, the pirates had indeed bombarded them with the swivel gun they'd managed to dislodge from the Hispaniola and drag ashore. The thud of the cannonball impacting the thick log walls had been more disheartening than damaging, a psychological assault more than a physical one. It was a clear declaration of intent. They meant business, and they weren't going anywhere until they got what they wanted. Early next morning, as a low mist clung to the jungle floor, obscuring vision but amplifying sound, the waiting came to an end. It started with guttural shouts, faint at first, then growing into a rising chorus, echoing off the surrounding trees like the bloodthirsty roar of a vengeful Roman legion. The pirates were coming. This wasn't a cautious scouting party. This was a full-on, desperate charge. It felt less like a strategic siege and more like a stampede of very angry, rum-fueled hooligans. "Ready the muskets!" Smollett's voice cut through the air, calm and authoritative, the only stable sound in a rapidly unraveling world. From your position at one of the loopholes, peering through a narrow gap in the logs, you saw them. A horde of rough, ill-disciplined men, some with cutlasses waving, some clutching boarding pikes, others firing muskets wildly as they surged towards the stockade. Long John Silver, despite his missing leg, somehow managed to keep pace, rallying his men with furious shouts. He was no longer the jovial cook. His face was a mask of cold fury. His parrot, Captain Flint, probably shrieking encouragement from somewhere in the trees, wishing he had a mini cutlass. The first volley from the Loyalists was devastating. Captain Smollett had ordered them to hold their fire until the pirates were nearly upon the walls, a brutal but effective tactic designed to maximize impact and compensate for their numerical disadvantage. The coordinated roar of their muskets tore through the mist, sending men tumbling and screams ripping through the air. You, with your own musket trembling in your hands, fired. The recoil bruised your shoulder, but the distinct scent of gunpowder and the satisfying feeling of contributing to the defense hardened your resolve. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was a matter of life and death, and your life depended on every single agonizing breath. But the pirates were many and desperate. Even after sustaining casualties, the main body of them pressed on, scrambling over the fallen and pushing their way towards the stockade wall like determined, incredibly aggressive ants at a picnic. A few brave or foolish pirates managed to climb atop the stockade itself, hacking wildly at the logs with axes. One large bearded man, bleeding from a shoulder wound, pulled himself up right in front of your loophole. You instinctively thrust your bayonet forward, the steel glinting, and he cried out, losing his grip, tumbling backward into the thorny bushes below with a sickening crunch. You were shaking, but you'd done it. You'd defended yourself, however clumsily. It's an odd fact that during battle, stress can release adrenaline and endorphins, momentarily dulling pain and heightening senses, making people capable of acts they wouldn't normally consider, though probably not giving you superpowers. The fighting was furious and chaotic. Dr. Livesey, ever composed, stood by Smollett, tending to the wounded while calmly reloading muskets and occasionally even firing his own. He was the quiet anchor of reason and competence amidst the brutal chaos. Squire Trelawney, surprisingly, fought with surprising valor. His bumbling optimism seemed to have transformed into a fierce, almost primal protective instinct, perhaps realizing the full weight of his folly and hoping to redeem it through bloodshed. He blasted away with a flintlock pistol, shouting defiance at the top of his lungs, less a gentleman and more a glorified cowboy, making more noise than actual impact, perhaps. He certainly reminded you that no matter how good your upbringing is, once the lead starts flying, everyone turns into a panicked savage for a brief, glorious moment. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from another part of the palisade. The pirates, through sheer brute force and relentless assaults, had managed to break through one section of the wall. 3 men poured inside, brandishing their cutlasses, eager for the kill. One of them, a monstrous brute named O'Brien, was immediately confronted by Captain Smollett himself, who, despite a shoulder wound from a glancing blow, fought with tactical brilliance. Smollett dispatched O'Brien with a single, precise thrust of his sword, showing the superior training of a naval officer compared to the wild slashes of an undisciplined pirate. The loyal sailor Abraham Gray, though wounded himself, fought valiantly, dispatching 2 more of the boarders. Their coordinated professional response contained the breach quickly. This focus on discipline and superior training highlights a key aspect of naval warfare of the era, where a small but well-trained crew often had a significant advantage over larger, less organized privateers or pirates, even if they sometimes ended up on deserted islands being besieged by those very pirates. The siege continued for what felt like an eternity, punctuated by the frantic sounds of desperate combat. The acrid smell of burnt powder hung in the air, mixing with the damp earth and the coppery tang of fresh blood. The sounds of human pain, curses, cries, and a haunting silence from the less fortunate filled the air. After what seemed like an eternity of unrelenting pressure, the tide slowly began to turn. The pirates, their numbers severely reduced, their initial frenzied charge losing momentum, began to falter. Their lack of discipline, a recurring theme, worked against them in a protracted engagement. When faced with sustained resistance and dwindling numbers, Their greed for easy plunder turned into a desire for self-preservation. Historians still debate whether internal morale or tactical disadvantage was the primary reason for pirate assaults to often fail against determined fortified resistance. But watching these rogues break, it seemed their eagerness for an easy score vanished quickly in the face of true hardship and losses. Finally, Long John Silver, observing the carnage and the diminishing ranks of his crew, let out a frustrated bellow, ordering a retreat. The remaining pirates scrambled back through the jungle, leaving behind a grim testament to their failed assault. The bodies of their comrades, some entangled in the dense foliage, others lying eerily still beneath the harsh glare of the tropical sun. The stockade, battered and scarred, remained standing. Inside, the Loyalists surveyed the aftermath. 3 of their brave men were dead, including Abraham Gray, who had succumbed to his wounds, and Captain Smollett himself was badly wounded, but still giving orders, albeit with more difficulty. The victory, though costly, was absolute. The silence that descended after the last pirate yells faded was deafening, broken only by the whimpers of the injured and the mournful calls of exotic birds. Exhaustion washed over everyone, heavy and bone-deep, leaving them limp with the release of tension. The threat, however, was far from over. The pirates, though repulsed, still had the ship. They still controlled the only means of escape, and they still vastly outnumbered the defenders. The stockade was secure for now, but you knew instinctively that this was just the beginning. The next move, a desperate one, would have to come from inside the stockade itself, or rather, from one incredibly reckless, cheese-craving boy with a wild new ally and an improbable plan brewing in his overstimulated young mind. The sun had climbed high over the ravaged stockade, baking the damp earth and clinging to the smell of blood and gunpowder that still permeated the air. Inside the fortified walls, exhaustion was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The Loyalists, diminished in number, nursed their wounds. Captain Smollett lay groaning from a painful shoulder injury, and the raw sorrow for their fallen comrades, particularly Abraham Gray, weighed heavily on their hearts. The victory, though won, felt thin and precarious. They had repelled the immediate assault, yes, but the chilling reality lingered. The pirates still possessed the Hispaniola, the only true key to their escape. You felt useless, sitting around the camp, hearing the quiet laments and the endless, strategizing murmurs of the adults, who seemed to have no good answers, like watching a really slow game of chess, where everyone already knows the loser. The captain, despite his pain, constantly worried. "They have the ship," he repeated, his voice raspy with effort. "And so long as they have her, they have us, trapped here. It's only a matter of time before they reorganize, perhaps find a better method of attack, or simply starve us out." His words echoed your own fears. You were a cage, a temporary defensible bubble in a hostile jungle. Escape required a way to reclaim the Hispaniola, and short of a miracle, or a very bad navigation error on the pirates' part, it seemed utterly impossible. But your youthful impatience chafed at the helplessness. Sitting idly, watching the flies buzz and listening to the mournful sounds of the jungle wasn't your style. The adrenaline that had propelled you through the previous day's terror was slowly transforming into a restless energy, an unbearable need to do something. You recalled the discussions in the captain's cabin before the landing of the Hispaniola being anchored far out in the cove, seemingly deserted, as the pirate faction was mainly ashore, chasing the dream of treasure, leaving only a skeletal crew. You'd also thought about what Ben Gunn had said, and his own bizarre little invention. The coracle. An idea, half-formed and completely reckless, began to sprout in your mind, like a mischievous, slightly dangerous little plant in the darkest corner of your consciousness. You watched the sun begin to dip, painting the horizon in hues of orange and purple. Soon, the suffocating cloak of night would descend, bringing with it both danger and opportunity. While the rest of the Loyalists settled in for a nervous, fitful rest, their injuries and weariness preventing long discussions or complex plans, you slipped away. It was a secret you kept even from the doctor, knowing he would instantly forbid it, much like a responsible parent forbidding you from trying to fly off the roof using a bedsheet. This bold plan was yours, and yours alone. Stealthily, you moved through the moonlit camp. The sentries were exhausted, perhaps nodding off at their posts or simply preoccupied with their own lingering trauma. You had the agility of youth and the silent footsteps of someone who'd often snuck into the inn's larder for a midnight snack. It wasn't hard to slide between two tightly lashed barrels and disappear into the embracing darkness of the jungle beyond the palisade walls. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and unknown blossoms, a world away from the lingering stench of fear and burnt powder in the stockade. Navigating the jungle at night was even more terrifying than during the day. Every shadow seemed to twist into monstrous shapes. Every rustle of leaves could be a sleeping boa constrictor or a waiting pirate. You moved by instinct, following the faint sounds of the sea and the general direction Ben Gunn had given you for his little boat. Thorns tore at your clothes and scratched your skin, but the fear of being caught, either by pirates or the angry doctor, drove you forward. The notion that historically, experienced mariners sometimes developed uncanny nocturnal navigation skills was a distant thought. You just felt your way forward, guided by raw necessity, and hoping not to fall into a pit full of very disappointed snakes. Finally, you reached the small, secluded inlet Ben had described. There it was, his makeshift boat, a primitive vessel known as a coracle, lashed discreetly to a tangle of roots at the water's edge. It looked less like a proper boat and more like a half-shelled, badly crafted egg, woven from willow branches and covered in goat hides, caulked with tar. It was small, barely big enough for one person, and distinctly unstable, resembling something you'd build for a backyard pond project, not to navigate dangerous ocean waters. Still, it was a boat. Your boat, for the night. You gently tugged at the fastenings, your fingers fumbling with nerves in the gloom. Pushing the coracle into the gentle lapping waves, you gingerly climbed inside. The boat rocked precariously under your weight, feeling less like a vessel and more like a very enthusiastic pendulum. A thin wooden paddle, barely more than a flat piece of wood on a stick, was its sole means of propulsion. You dipped the paddle into the water, silently, and began to move out of the sheltered inlet. The open water felt immense, terrifying, and completely alien under the vast expanse of the starlit sky. The tide, gentle at first, caught your small craft, tugging it steadily towards the Hispaniola. You had no control over its speed, only its direction. This was terrifying, because you had to remain unseen and unheard. You could hear the faint murmur of voices, the occasional shout, coming from the pirate camp ashore, but their focus was still on the landlocked loyalists, completely unaware of the tiny, egg-shaped vessel drifting through the darkness. The ship was quiet, though a faint lantern light flickered at the mast. There must be a skeletal crew, but certainly not the bulk of Silver's gang. It made sense. With their grand plan to conquer the island, they had concentrated their forces there, likely leaving only one or two to watch the vessel. Historians still debate the practicalities of leaving valuable ships minimally crewed. Typically, even small crews were armed and capable of swift, brutal action against boarders. However, a crew of 2 or 3 drunken, unconcerned pirates is a very different beast to tackle. As you drifted closer, the enormity of your daring gambit truly settled in. This wasn't just stealing a ship. This was sailing a small, unstable teacup in choppy water towards an unknown number of murderous buccaneers, alone, in the dead of night, hoping to do what exactly? Disable it? Cut it loose? The actual mechanics of reclaiming the Hispaniola by yourself were, frankly, utterly beyond you. An ambitious undertaking, like trying to rearrange a major city's infrastructure using only a toy shovel and an inspiring YouTube video. You only knew Shin Manitu Tiang. This was the ship they needed, and you were its best or perhaps its only hope. Your hands, already chafed, tightened on the crude paddle, and your teeth chattered less from the cool night air and more from sheer, unadulterated terror. You were about to do something stupid, brave, and potentially catastrophic, all rolled into one leaky goat-hide package. The fate of the loyal crew, perhaps even the success of the entire expedition, depended entirely on your impulsive, desperate, youthful gamble. And for a moment, the only thing you could hear, apart from the creaking of your flimsy craft, was Ben Gunn's crazed cackle about cheese. Your crude goat-hide coracle bobbed gently, precariously, on the black waters of the cove. The silent lapping of the waves against the flimsy hull was the only sound for what felt like an eternity. The distant sounds of the pirate camp ashore, punctuated by the occasional drunken shout or bursts of laughter, slowly faded as the tide, ever so obligingly, tugged your little eggshell of a boat out toward the anchored Hispaniola. Every nerve ending was alight with a strange cocktail of terror and an almost absurd determination. This wasn't just a childish impulse anymore, it was an active act of war, albeit one waged by a nervous boy in a homemade canoe. You really hoped you weren't about to make the rookie mistake of forgetting your proverbial parachute on this skydiving mission. As you drew closer, the schooner loomed like a silent, ghostly sentinel. Her dark form stood stark against the lighter gray of the pre-dawn sky, her masts reaching up like skeletal fingers, grasping at stars. The wind had dropped, and the ship rode at anchor with only a gentle sway. The Hispaniola felt deserted. Only a single lantern, high on the mast, flickered faintly, a tiny ember in the vast darkness. This quietude was a double-edged sword, a relief that the ship wasn't bristling with alert pirates, but also unsettling. Where was everyone? Could it be a trap? Or were they just really bad at night shifts? Historians still debate the effectiveness of night watches in poorly disciplined pirate or privateer crews, but it seems Silver's men were leaning heavily into the less disciplined camp. Your plan, if it could even be called that, was gloriously simple and equally perilous. Cut the Hispaniola adrift, remove the anchor cable, and the ship, with the help of the current, would eventually drift away, leaving the pirates stranded on the island without a means of escape. It sounded perfectly logical if you squinted at it in the dark, with no prior maritime experience. With agonizing slowness, you maneuvered the coracle to the Hispaniola's stern, using the thin paddle to push off her hull. You heard no challenge, no shouts, just the gentle slap of water. You found the long cable securing the vessel, taut in the water, stretched deep into the gloom. You couldn't just hack at it with a butter knife, you'd need something substantial. Thankfully, in a stroke of sheer luck or poetic justice, a knife had fallen from the body of a dead pirate the previous day as you stumbled over him after the initial gunshots. You had kept it, perhaps instinctively, or perhaps out of morbid curiosity. The heavy blade felt cold and comforting in your hand, a tangible tool in a sea of overwhelming uncertainties. The challenge was to get to the cable's weak point, to cut it clean. You grasped the huge cable, running your hands along it, looking for the natural chafing of the hawse hole, where the ship itself rubbed against the rope, creating the point of maximum vulnerability. Your arm muscles strained. Sawing through thick, tarred cable in a tiny, unstable boat, bobbing gently in a black sea, was remarkably difficult, like trying to cut a steak with a very dull plastic fork while riding a very unstable seesaw in the middle of a power outage. You scraped and cut, using all your meager strength, your breath hissing through clenched teeth. Sweat beaded on your brow despite the cool night air. The blade grated against the tough fibers, tearing and separating them slowly, painfully. It felt like hours, though it was likely mere minutes. Finally, with a final, desperate hack, the cable parted with a dull groan, a sound like a great beast sighing its last breath. The heavy chain snaked away into the depths, and with that, the Hispaniola, now a rogue vessel, slowly, imperceptibly at first, began to move. A subtle shift in the air, a gentle nudge. You looked up. The moon, now higher, was bathing the island in its ethereal glow, and the outline of Spyglass Hill began to slowly recede behind you. A thrilling sense of triumph mingled with the sudden, stark terror of being alone on an enormous, drifting ship. This was it. No turning back. This ship, like your stomach at a moment's notice, was now free to do whatever it pleased. Whatever amount or as the current, now a gentle tug, caught the Hispaniola and pulled her towards the open sea, you noticed something else. Movement. On deck. Someone. Your heart plummeted back to your stomach, which was already feeling rather empty. Had a pirate come back from shore? Had someone been sleeping below deck? You cautiously pulled your coracle alongside the schooner and carefully, silently, scrambled over the bulwarks and onto the main deck. The air was thick with the faint stench of stale rum and uncleaned vomit, and an even fainter, more metallic tang of blood. The flickering lantern light illuminated the horrifying scene. Stretched across the deck, utterly motionless, was a body. It was Israel Hands, the pirate whose voice you'd heard conspiratorially planning murder with Long John Silver inside that apple barrel. And next to him, another pirate. Both were horribly wounded, their clothes clotted with dark blood, their faces frozen in a rictus of surprise and pain. They must have been on watch when the cannon from the shore battery accidentally blew off some crucial piece of the Hispaniola during the earlier siege against the stockade, the one you just escaped from. An off-topic fact for you, accidental cannon explosions were surprisingly common during this era due to mishandling gunpowder or improper loading, truly emphasizing the phrase, handle with care. Israel Hands, to your profound terror and even greater shock, suddenly let out a faint groan. He was not dead. Not yet. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain and delirium, yet focused on you with a terrible, vengeful gleam. He had somehow survived the blast, grievously wounded, likely suffering from massive internal injuries and dehydration, too weak to move, yet conscious. The other pirate was definitively gone, so it was just you and Israel Hands. You, an exhausted boy who had just cut loose a ship twice your size, and he, a half-dead, mutinous sailor with murder in his eyes and probably a splitting headache. What an ideal scenario. It was like a particularly bad co-ed camp trip where you wake up and realize your tent mate is a critically wounded murderer, and also the tent is floating out to sea. Hands, seeing you, immediately seemed to recognize the desperate situation, both yours and his. He rasped something, but his voice was too faint to understand. He tried to gesture, a hand shaking weakly in your direction, and the action sent a spasm of pain through him, making him grit his teeth. You suddenly had a choice. Kill him now, or try to manage the ship and this fatally wounded but still deadly threat. You, a young boy with barely a handful of life's responsibilities, were now essentially the unwilling medic and warden and navigator. As the Hispaniola slowly began to pick up speed with the tide, leaving Treasure Island far behind, the game began. The ship became a haunted house on the water, a silent, deadly battlefield where you and a barely conscious pirate were the only players. Hands, despite his incapacitation, was still cunning. He knew the ship, perhaps even in his delirious state, could attempt to trick you into performing actions that might somehow benefit him or bring about your doom. His hand twitched. You instinctively backed away. His good hand, slowly, almost imperceptibly, reached for something nearby, a discarded dagger, perhaps. This wasn't a loud, brutal fight like the one at the stockade. This was a silent, psychological duel. The Hispaniola was drifting aimlessly, out of control, pulling you both further and further from land. You were faced with a dilemma. You needed to secure the ship to eventually get it back to the Loyalists. But to do so, you had to either manage Hands or disable him permanently. His groans punctuated the silence, turning a gentle ship's rocking into something unnervingly sinister. You found the helm? You could turn it, try to steer, but the sails were haphazardly set, and the rudder was unresponsive to any effective navigation. You didn't have enough experienced crew, or even one effective crewman, to raise new sails or adjust anything substantial. Your knowledge of seamanship was limited to what you'd seen. So, with no proper sails set, and a gravely wounded Israel Hands constantly under your gaze, the ship merely drifted, a rudderless ghost. It felt like being trapped in a driverless car on the open road, except the other passenger is barely conscious and actively dislikes you. Hans's movements, though agonizingly slow, indicated that he had some plan, even if only to pull you down with him. You had to move carefully. He lay there like a serpent, coiled, waiting for your moment of weakness. Every time you tried to focus on securing a sail or understanding the rigging, his gaze seemed to follow you, chilling you to the bone. Your decision was made. You needed to gain full control of the ship, and to do that, you would have to make sure Hans was no longer a threat. You understood now the meaning of their murderous world, where trust was a luxury you couldn't afford, and violence was often the only common language. The Hispaniola drifted. Slowly, inevitably, the tide and the capricious whim of the light morning breeze tugged her further and further from the shadowed peaks of Treasure Island. The world felt vast and empty, broken only by the mournful creak of timbers and the soft, slithering sounds of water against the hull. You were alone at the helm, a small, weary boy at the enormous wheel, watching the dying figure of Israel Hands, who lay slumped on the bloodied deck, his eyes fixed on you with an unsettling mix of pain and malevolence. It was less like sailing a ship and more like playing a very grim game of cat and mouse in a vast, silent, floating tomb. Your mind, despite the exhaustion, raced. You needed to secure the ship, to regain control, to eventually get her back to Dr. Livesey and Captain Smollett. But with Hand still breathing, even faintly, you knew you couldn't fully trust him. He was like a discarded but still charged battery. You didn't know when, or if, it might deliver one last, fatal shock. And right now, he had the advantage of knowledge. He knew the ship, its layout, its secrets far better than you did. Your maritime experience up to this point largely consisted of scrubbing decks and listening to pirates lie. Hand stirred. A low moan escaped his lips, and he gestured weakly with a hand towards his chest. His good hand, you noticed, slowly began to slide under his bloodied shirt, the gesture almost imperceptible unless you were watching him, utterly devoid of any trust. His eyes, though glazed with pain, were cunning, setim, assessing, like those of a cornered predator hoping for one last trick. "Water, matey," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "A drop of water." It was a plausible request, one any human might make, but knowing his treacherous nature, every fiber of your being screamed. Trap! What was he doing under his shirt? Was he reaching for a hidden knife, a small pistol? The pirates had already shown a terrifying disregard for life, even that of their own companions, so any seemingly innocent request could easily be a diversion for a fatal attack. You edged closer, a makeshift cutlass clutched in your trembling hand, which, in reality, was little more than a slightly blunted butter knife in comparison to a real pirate weapon. Your heart hammered against your ribs. You poured some fresh water into a tin cup, keeping your eyes on Hans, wary of his every subtle movement. You brought it slowly to him. He gulped it down, his gaze never leaving yours, his breathing ragged. "Aye, a true good deed," he wheezed. Then his eyes flickered to a coil of rope near the mast. "That rope there, lad, needs fastening." He made another weak gesture. "Just give her a pull. I'm a bleedin' out here, Jim." He feigned helplessness, his face contorting in what looked like agony, designed to lull you into a false sense of security. You eyed the rope. It seemed innocuous enough, and the action he requested appeared harmless. But you remembered Captain Smollett's constant emphasis on never turning your back on danger. Every instinct, sharpened by recent brutal experience, screamed, "He's luring you." It's an odd fact that during the golden age of piracy, deception and feigned vulnerability were common tactics both in sea battles and individual confrontations. A dying pirate was often still a dangerous one. You made a conscious decision not to give him your back. You edged towards the helm again, a sense of mounting unease chilling you. The ship was slowly changing course, the rudder drifting, the Hispaniola beginning to sail straight into what looked like a dangerously strong current, heading for a shallow sandbar that bristled with ominous-looking black rocks. It was a terrifying thought, sinking not by mutiny, but by maritime accident while debating a wounded man. Hand seemed to sense your wariness. His expression darkened, his voice gained a sudden, desperate strength. "Stand clear, you spawn of Satan!" he snarled, suddenly, savagely, unleashing a long-held fury. His hand, which had been hidden all this time, shot out from beneath his shirt, revealing a small, wickedly sharp dagger. A real one this time, glinting cold in the dappled sunlight. It wasn't the giant machete you'd always imagined, but something more insidious and practical. He lunged, despite his injuries, with a shocking burst of energy, aiming directly for your chest. You reacted on instinct, dropping the wheel, your small frame ducking sideways as the knife whizzed past, catching only a wisp of your shirt. Hands, however, was unbalanced, weakened by blood loss, and probably just really unlucky. He stumbled, missing his target. You scrambled backward, trying to create distance between yourself and the unexpectedly tenacious pirate. He struggled to regain his balance, propping himself up on one hand, the dagger held ready, his eyes burning with renewed fury. This wasn't going to be an easy capture. You realized this wasn't about securing the ship anymore. It was about pure survival. You glanced wildly around the deck for something. Anything. Your eyes landed on the ship's foremast. A slender, stiff wooden pole, designed for steering, stood next to the helm. It was attached to the mizzenmast by a strong rope. Not exactly a weapon, but you knew what you could use it for. As Hand struggled to advance, his face contorted in a grimace of pain and determination. You didn't fight fair. You grabbed the pole, raising it over your head. He snarled, his eyes wide with a combination of rage and a sliver of desperate hope as he lunged one more time. "No more hands!" you cried, your voice cracking with fear and resolution. As he came at you, surprisingly swift for a dying man, you hurled the short spear with all your might. It wasn't a skilled throw. It was pure, unadulterated, desperate effort. But it struck true. The spear impaled him through his shoulder, pinning him firmly to the foremast like a pinned butterfly specimen, only far more terrifying and covered in more grime. He let out a shriek, a gurgling, horrible sound of surprise and pain. His remaining strength vanished instantly. His body sagged against the mast, the dagger clattering harmlessly to the deck as his hand went limp. Historians still debate whether all pirates faced violent and inglorious ends, or if some managed to escape justice and retire to quiet lives. However, for Israel Hands, it was a bloody, decisive conclusion on the open sea, ironically caused by an angry young boy who couldn't be duped. You stood panting, staring at the sight, your stomach lurching. It was done. The threat was neutralized. The silence that descended was absolute, save for the rhythmic creak of the Hispaniola and the almost cheerful cry of a distant gull. You had just defeated a murderous pirate, alone, with nothing but wits and a stray spear. You felt a wave of triumph, dizzying and exhilarating, followed quickly by the crushing weight of realization that you had just, for all intents and purposes, committed homicide. But it was in self-defense, of course. Self-defense on a drifting pirate ship against a literal pirate who tried to kill you with a hidden blade. Seems pretty justifiable on the old moral compass. With hands definitively dealt with, and the ship drifting dangerously close to the rocky shoal, your focus immediately shifted to the helm. Now, with no immediate threat, you could apply yourself fully to the task. You took the wheel firmly, your hands feeling more capable, and began to understand the mechanics of the Hispaniola from your new perspective. With a new determination, you worked methodically. First, you checked the rudder chain. Then, you examined the few remaining sails that were loosely set. You carefully turned the helm, feeling the ship's gentle response. The rudder was working. A true captain knew that feeling of connection with their vessel, sensing the wind and the currents almost intuitively. You had watched Smollett enough to get a basic understanding. Your aim was clear. Get the ship to the nearest safe anchorage, as far as possible from the pirate camp, and preferably somewhere you could either land safely or attract the attention of passing ships. The danger of running aground, especially on such a notoriously uncharted coast, was still immense, but at least now you could actively steer the ship. You worked at adjusting the mizzen sails, though not a professional, pulling and pushing with effort. The Hispaniola finally, slowly but surely, began to respond. She pointed her bow towards a clearer stretch of the ocean, moving away from the treacherous sandbar and its ominous rocks. You were charting your own course now, literally and figuratively. As the morning light grew brighter, painting the sea in hues of deep blue and silver, you felt a surge of pride. The Hispaniola was yours. You had wrested her from the clutches of the mutineers, alone, and by sheer force of desperate will. The immediate future of the Loyalists depended on you getting this ship back, but now the critical phase was complete. You had turned a vessel of peril into a vehicle of rescue. The wind ruffled your hair, the salt spray invigorated you, and the open sea, once a source of terror, now seemed to stretch out like an invitation to safety. And somehow, you, a simple innkeeper's boy, were now at the helm of a captured pirate schooner, sailing triumphantly. Oddly, shipwrats are very common, but somehow you've yet to see a single one on board, a blessing given the whole death on the high seas thing. Good for you, Jim. Less chance of plague after your harrowing experience. You were the master of your own destiny, perched at the helm of the Hispaniola. The vast cerulean expanse of the open sea lay before you, finally clear of the menacing sandbar. The triumph, the raw, unfiltered adrenaline of outmaneuvering Israel hands and liberating the ship, was a heady rush, like finding out you aced a test you were sure you'd failed. For a brief, glorious time, the ship was yours, and you were its tiny, victorious commander, with no one to question your questionable piloting skills. You tried to chart a course away from the pirate camp, towards a more secluded part of the coast, perhaps a bay, where you could safely run the ship aground and rendezvous with Dr. Livesey and the others later. Or perhaps just park it safely and swim ashore, given your limited maritime knowledge. You considered that maybe, just maybe, this adventure was turning in your favor, a brief glimmer of optimism in a storm of danger. But the silence, once a welcome absence of pirate yells, now felt eerily heavy. Hours passed as the sun climbed higher, beating down on the deck. The ship, once a symbol of liberation, began to feel like a very large, empty prison. You were alone, and the sheer responsibility of commanding a vessel like the Hispaniola overwhelmed your brief feeling of glory. You barely knew port from starboard, let alone how to safely anchor or truly secure a ship. What if the Loyalists sent a boat, and you weren't there? What if another pirate found her? What if a squall hit? You, Jim, were simply a boy with a captured schooner, and you desperately needed adult supervision, preferably without bloodlust. So, despite the clear and present danger of the pirates, and perhaps because of a severe lack of alternative options and the sheer terror of remaining alone, you decided to head back to the stockade. Your logic was shaky at best, but it was logic born of isolation and desperation. Your friends were there, presumably safe. They needed the ship. You had freed it. You were the hero. It seemed the logical next step. It was, of course, exactly the kind of stupidly brave thing only a tired, stressed-out teenager with a history of impulsive decisions would do. As you guided the Hispaniola, awkwardly and slowly, towards the familiar landmark of Spyglass Hill, your mind filled with anticipation of the joyous reunion. You pictured Dr. Livesey's calm nod of approval, Squire Trelawney's booming congratulations, maybe even some of Ben Gunn's much-craved cheese. You finally managed to anchor the ship clumsily off a different part of the coast, less populated by jungle, and dropped a smaller, more secure anchor than the one you'd so triumphantly severed. It felt like parking a massive, unwieldy vehicle you'd hotwired, hoping you could remember where you put the emergency brake. Then, using one of the ship's remaining small dinghies, you rowed yourself to shore. The jungle seemed less oppressive this time, but every shadow still felt like a hiding place for a waiting pirate. You moved cautiously, pushing through the tangled undergrowth, trying to approach the stockade silently. You expected the shouts of joy, the triumphant cries of the loyalists. But as you drew closer, an uneasy silence, not of peace, but of emptiness, pervaded the clearing. The air around the stockade was still. No cheerful voices, no crackling campfire. Your heart sank. Something was wrong, very wrong. This was like showing up to a party, expecting all your friends, and finding a dark, deserted house with the ominous flickering of an unfamiliar, strange light coming from the windows. Cautiously, you crept forward. You saw traces of recent habitation. Scattered musket balls, perhaps, more than you would expect from the skirmish from ease ago. Then, a single, definitive, dreadful sign. Pirate clothing, not merely scattered rags from the retreat, but clothes left behind, as though someone had taken up residence. You pressed yourself against the cool, rough bark of a giant tree just outside the palisade. From inside the stockade walls you could hear it. A low, ragged chuckle. Then another voice, rough and slurred. Drunken. You realized with a crushing, sickening certainty, the pirates were inside, not the loyalists. Your friends were gone, and you, Jim, were now precisely where the wolves wanted you. Your first impulse was to turn and run, back to the dinghy, back to the safety of the Hispaniola, however unwieldy she was. But it was too late. Before you could even formulate an escape route, a hand, strong and surprisingly fast, clamped down on your shoulder. You whirled around, terrified. It was the grizzled face of George Merry, one of Silver's most loyal and brutish lieutenants. He wore a grim smirk, his eyes glittering with cold triumph. He had evidently been stationed on guard duty outside the stockade, his attention on the approaches rather than the retreat route. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he rasped, his voice full of cruel satisfaction. Another pirate, barely seen, appeared from the shadows behind him, closing off your escape. You were dragged inside, utterly helpless, your triumphant feelings now shriveled into bitter ashes. The scene inside the stockade was a complete travesty of the orderly camp you'd left. It was chaos, filth, and squalor. Rubbish littered the ground. Unfinished food lay abandoned. Empty rum bottles were scattered everywhere like sinister skittles. The air was thick with the reek of stale liquor, unwashed bodies, and despair. And in the center of it all, propped uncomfortably against the palisade, nursing a glass of rum and looking rather displeased, was Long John Silver. He still carried himself with a terrifying authority, but the earlier jovial facade was entirely gone. He looked less like a respectable innkeeper and more like a disgruntled, aging despot. The remnants of his gang, perhaps half a dozen or so, were slumped around, ragged, demoralized, and thoroughly disgusted with their lot, muttering curses at one another, looking more like defeated sports fans than formidable villains. It was clear their morale was at an all-time low after the disastrous attack on the stockade, and with the ship gone, they felt abandoned and tricked. Silver's eyes fixed on you as you were unceremoniously shoved into the stockade, the cold glint of triumph briefly flashing through them before they hardened. "Well, blow me down if it ain't Jim Hawkins himself," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual false warmth. He looked less surprised and more resigned, as if your appearance merely confirmed another of his cynical calculations. "Come to join the party, eh? A bit late, as usual." His words dripped with a sarcasm colder than the rum he was nursing. "Where have you been, boy? We missed you sorely." The Loyalists, Silver explained with a sneer, had left. They'd given up the stockade to Silver's faction, presumably for reasons he chose not to elaborate on, or perhaps because they were too wounded to hold it effectively, or too few. He simply twisted the narrative. "They ran off, boy. Scared of real men, those soft gentlemen." It wasn't the whole truth, you knew, but it served his purpose. The absence of Smollett and Livesey created a profound emptiness in your stomach that echoed the emptiness of the Loyalist supplies. They were gone. Silver, for all his villainy, had one redeeming quality, if you could call it that. His bizarre soft spot for you, Jim. Or perhaps it was simply his canny opportunism. Despite his anger and the disastrous turn of events for him, he immediately saw your potential value. You to us, after all, were the only one who could conceivably bring the Hispaniola back, as you were the one who had taken it away from them in the first place, thus disrupting their whole plot. A twist in their tale as baffling to them as a pop-up ad mid-fight scene. "Fetch him a glass of rum," he commanded one of the pirates, a sickly-looking fellow named Dirk. "He's tired from all that wandering." His tone was mocking, but beneath it, there was an unmistakable undercurrent of strategic thinking. You knew you were too valuable to kill. Yet, this strange new dynamic instantly created a profound, disturbing tension. You, their prisoner, were also their reluctant ticket to salvation. Silver, their undisputed leader, was suddenly in a bind. His grand plan of acquiring treasure by cunning had crumbled. His ship was gone. His men were mutinous and losing faith. And now this boy, this constant thorn in his side, had turned up with the crucial piece of information, the very ship that held their fates. The pirates were in despair. They knew their prospects were dire. Historians still debate the specific codes of conduct concerning prisoners of war on pirate vessels, but it seems when morale is low and desperate times call for desperate measures, things are far less formalized than a typical naval engagement, leading to very creative and uncomfortable solutions for the prisoners. The other pirates, a collection of miserable, unwashed ruffians, glared at you, their faces grim. "What about the ship, Silver?" one of them grumbled, eyes burning with resentment. "We ain't got no ship. That was your grand plan." Their collective frustration focused on Silver, who, despite his masterful control, seemed to be teetering on the edge of losing it entirely. Their desperation, like the rising temperature of a boiling pot, threatened to overwhelm the pot entirely. They had tried to depose Silver earlier, a small contingent led by the one still living, one of the remaining 6, George Merry and one other. That same day he came back after losing all of the fights against Livesey's people at the fort, trying to make Silver suffer because it was his bad plan after all. Their discontent festered like a festering wound in the putrid air of the stockade. Then it came, the black spot. It was a slip of paper, small and round, ripped from a Bible, black on one side and bearing an inscription, not Varna this time, but deposition. A direct challenge to Silver's leadership. George Merry, emboldened by the despair of his shipmates and your own presence, a boy who clearly wasn't part of Silver's plan, if Silver even had one at this point, shoved it into Silver's hand. Silver simply smiled, a tight, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, the black spot, is it?" he drawled, his voice strangely calm. "Well, boys, it's about time." It was a classic pirate maneuver, meant to force a captain to stand trial before his own crew for perceived incompetence or wrongdoing, less like a legal deposition and more like an impromptu mob trial. An odd fact for you, while the black spot is legendary, true pirate lore suggests physical punishments or challenges were far more common ways to overthrow a captain. Silver's response was a masterclass in manipulation. He kept his calm, acknowledged their grievance, and then deftly turned the tables. "You're angry," he said, surveying them all with an unnervingly calm gaze. "And ye have a right to be. We lost the fight. But whose fault is it, really? Whose fault is it that we got stuck on this blasted rock?" He pointed a gnarled finger at a disgruntled Mary. "Was it I who couldn't hit a broadside of a barn with a musket, Mary? Was it I who decided to leave a lone ship just waiting to be nabbed?" He launched into a fiery, persuasive speech, twisting logic into knots, laying the blame for their predicament at every doorstep but his own, mostly on the soft-handed gentry who dared to actually wound them, and the Hispaniola for just running away, an almost magical vanishing act that was totally inexplicable. He blamed the land, the air, the unwashed rum glasses, anything but himself. His rhetoric was impressive. Within minutes, he had convinced the easily swayed pirates that it was the gentleman's cunning, or pure bad luck, that was the root of their problems, not his leadership. He reminded them he had planned it carefully. Capture the fort when they could, but wait until the treasure was secured before the final confrontation. It was pure bravado and a clever retcon. And then, in a devastating move, he reminded them that he was the only one who still knew where the treasure was supposed to be, and, more crucially, the only one who seemed to have any influence, however tenuous, over you. "And look," he announced, gesturing at you, "young Jim here? Why, he's back, ain't he? Back in our hands. Perhaps he can explain what happened to our beautiful ship." His eyes met yours, a cold challenge in their depths. Your life hung precariously in the balance. You had freed the Hispaniola, only to trap yourself among the last, most desperate, and thoroughly disoriented members of a dying pirate gang. You knew, as the ragged crew started looking at you with a new, terrifyingly focused interest, that your role as hostage was just beginning. You were still alive, but it felt more like a chilling purgatory than a triumphant homecoming. The full horror of the predicament settled deep in your bones, much like the general unpleasantness of being constantly surrounded by dirty pirates. You were a bird in a very uncomfortable cage. 1 minute, you were triumphantly piloting the Hispaniola through the morning sea, a heroic young master. The next, you were unceremoniously shoved into a foul, decaying stockade, a prisoner of Long John Silver and his ragtag, disheartened crew. The triumph felt like a bitter joke, and your stomach clenched with fear. This was not the reunion you had imagined, not even close. It was less like arriving at a grand banquet, and more like stumbling into the unwashed kitchen at 3 a.m. and realizing the caterers are also bandits. The stockade, which just days before had been a meticulously organized, albeit desperate stronghold for your loyal friends, was now a squalid, stinking pit. Rubbish lay everywhere, half-eaten meals moldering on the ground, smashed bottles, torn bedding. The air hung thick with the stale scent of unwashed bodies, sour rum, and a pervasive despair that clung like a suffocating humidity. The small spring of fresh water, once a vital comfort, was now fouled with dirt and debris, a clear testament to the pirates' disregard for hygiene or self-preservation. It made you long for the relative cleanliness of your own inn, even with its broken door. It was an odd fact that during protracted pirate land occupations, hygiene often suffered catastrophically, leading to disease even before direct combat claimed lives. Silver, having deftly navigated the treacherous waters of the Black Spot challenge in the previous night, maintained his precarious hold on leadership. He was a master orator and manipulator, and his ability to redirect the raw anger of his men away from himself and to an external enemy, the clever gentleman who had seemingly tricked them, was a horrifying spectacle of political skill. But despite his smooth talk, the atmosphere was fragile. His men, a mere handful now, a collection of surly, wounded, and deeply resentful individuals, including the brutish George Merry, who still seethed under Silver's reign, watched you with an unsettling, predatory glint in their eyes. They hadn't forgiven him, not really. The animosity was palpable, a simmering undercurrent beneath every rough jest and grumbled command. It was less a cohesive unit, and more a den of disgruntled, ill-tempered wolves, barely held in check by Silver's iron will and formidable reputation. And in the middle of it all, you, Jim, were a walking contradiction. You were a hostage, certainly, under guard, unable to leave. But you were also, bizarrely, under Silver's peculiar protection. He had, as you noticed, already ensured that you had a space away from the worst of the squalor, a blanket, and even a plate of reasonably untouched food. Cold, salted beef, hardtack biscuits, but it was food. He seemed to view you less as an enemy, and more as a valuable, if exasperating, pawn. He treated you with a bizarre mixture of paternal concern and chilling calculation, always reminding you of your precarious position, but never threatening you directly, like a villain from a movie trying to convince the hero to join him, before inevitably failing. "Ah, Jim," he'd sigh, his voice surprisingly gentle at times. "You always make trouble for us, lad, but there's good in ye. Join us, and ye'll be rich and free." It was an absurd offer, the lure of stolen treasure for a boy who had no intention of being a cutthroat, much like a cat trying to tempt a dog into playing with a string, when the dog just wants to sniff things. Silver spent hours trying to draw you into his confidence, attempting to turn you to the pirate cause. He reminisced about his own youth, about his daring escapades with Captain Flint, portraying himself as a seasoned old sea dog whose loyalties were purely practical, always on the winning side. He spoke of the freedom, the wealth, the absence of law that defined a pirate's life, painting a picture that might entice a younger, less principled boy. "This here honest trade," he would say, tapping his crutch, "ain't so honest, Jim. Kings betray ye, officers cheat ye. With us, at least ye know where ye stand, and ye know where the gold is." It was an eloquent argument for moral relativism from a man with a wooden leg and questionable hygiene habits, emphasizing that pirates, despite their brutality, often viewed themselves as operating under their own, arguably fairer code of conduct, in opposition to corrupt naval or merchant systems. You, however, were not swayed. You looked at the ragged, suffering faces of his remaining men, the bitterness, the hopelessness, and you saw not freedom, but a pathetic, self-destructive doom. You clung to the knowledge you had about Ben Gunn and the Hispaniola, using it as a shield, subtly hinting at its location without revealing specifics. This allowed you to retain a small, vital measure of power in an otherwise utterly powerless situation. Silver constantly probed for information about the Hispaniola. "Where is she, Jim? Did you sail her off? Is she sunk?" He badgered you for details, alternating between cajoling and subtle menace, like a hungry lawyer interrogating a tight-lipped witness, only with more profanity. You merely remained stubbornly vague, fueling his frustration. Then, just as the pirate's despair reached its lowest point, as the constant bickering over dwindling provisions threatened to erupt into a fresh mutiny, an impossible sight appeared. Dr. Livesey himself, cool and composed as ever, with his doctor's wig still immaculately powdered, stepped into the clearing. He wore an air of quiet authority that immediately silenced the clamoring pirates. It was an astonishing, bewildering sight. What on earth was he doing there? Had he, Captain Smollett, and Squire Trelawney been defeated and captured after all? You could practically hear the record scratch sound effect as all pirate activity ceased. Dr. Livesey, with the unwavering calm of a man who dealt with hysterical patients every day, surveyed the filthy, dangerous scene before him with a detached, clinical eye. He announced that he had come for a parley, an old nautical term for a discussion, usually between enemies, to settle a dispute or negotiate terms. It was a bizarre diplomatic mission amidst a cesspool of disgruntled mutineers. He spoke to Silver, addressing him by his old rank. "Mr. Silver, I have come under a flag of truce to propose a resolution to this unpleasantness." His words, courteous yet firm, clearly threw Silver off balance. Then came the true bombshell. Dr. Livesey explained that the Loyalists had deliberately given up the stockade. They hadn't been defeated. Not exactly. Captain Smollett, though bravely repelling the attack, was severely wounded, and the fort, while defensible, was running short on provisions. And perhaps most importantly, they knew their numbers would never be sufficient to truly outlast the pirates, especially if the pirates learned how to better lay siege to it. And knowing the pirates' objective was treasure, Livesey's solution was an elegant, cruel gamble. Trade the stockade for a free shot at the treasure. He made it sound like a perfectly reasonable business deal, an exchange of strategic advantage. "We are no longer concerned with holding this fort," Livesey said, his voice flat. "But for the life of you, Jim, you could not fathom why on earth they would abandon such a good defensive position. What were they thinking?" And then Dr. Livesey dropped the real bomb. "The treasure is gone." The statement hung in the air, a physical weight that pressed down on every pirate. The gasps were audible. Silver himself, for the first time, looked truly unnerved. His jovial mask dropped completely. "Gone?" he stammered, a rare display of genuine shock. "What do you mean, gone?" Livesey merely smiled, a thin, knowing expression. He refused to elaborate, only stating that it was a fact, and advising Silver to cease his fruitless quest. He didn't mention Ben Gunn by name, nor did he explain how the treasure had been found and removed. This ambiguity, meant to dissuade the pirates, had the exact opposite effect. Silver and his desperate men were far too deep into their greed, their lust for gold too ingrained, to accept such a convenient truth. Historians still debate the precise psychological effects of treasure madness on individuals, where obsession can lead to extreme denial, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. But for Silver's crew, this news merely fueled their conviction that the gentlemen were simply trying to trick them out of their just rewards. They must be hiding it. As the doctor calmly walked out of the stockade, the pirates erupted in a cacophony of rage, fear, and renewed determination. They refused to believe him. It was a bluff, they cried, a trick to get them off the island without the gold. They were already this far, already betrayed, already suffered casualties. They wouldn't stop now. Their fury solidified into one common goal: find the treasure. And who, among their ragtag group, could best guide them? You. Jim Hawkins. You had Flint's map. You had been part of the initial treasure hunting party, even though you hadn't actively studied the map. You were, in their deluded eyes, the key to unlocking the fortune, especially as Silver explained to them that Captain Bones probably gave you the map because he knew you were loyal, and that this whole trip had been designed to lead them to it. He spun it beautifully. You were now less a hostage and more an indispensable divining rod to untold wealth. So, with Silver's dramatic flourishes and the grudging agreement of his desperate crew, the decision was made. The following morning, Jim Hawkins, under the watchful, vengeful eyes of Long John Silver and his last remaining men, would be led directly to the spot marked X. You watched them argue into the night, their voices growing louder as the rum flowed freely, the desperate hunger for gold outweighing all logic, or even their remaining fear. You felt a terrifying resignation settle over you. You were about to be used as bait, as a literal key to open a locked door. But the greatest irony of all was that you knew, with sickening certainty, that when they found the treasure pit, it would be utterly empty. The real prize, after all, was long gone, spirited away by a madman who only asked for cheese, leaving a monumental emptiness where countless pieces of eight should have been. You wondered how Silver would handle that surprise. You shivered, but not from the night chill. The dawn, on that fateful morning, did not break with the gentle, artistic light you might imagine from a peaceful sunrise. Instead, it ripped through the thick canopy of the jungle with an almost savage energy, as if the sun itself was impatient to reveal the island's secrets. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the still lingering tang of stale rum from the night before. You, Jim, were roused roughly from a restless, nightmare-filled sleep. The feeling of exhaustion mingled with the icy grip of fear in your stomach. Today was the day they would find the treasure, or rather, today was the day they would find absolutely nothing, and then likely find a very large, sharp problem for you. Silver, despite the grim turn of events and the visible animosity simmering among his last remaining men, seemed revitalized, even grimly cheerful. He hobbled about, issuing curt commands, his voice as sharp as his crutch. He barked orders to the other 5 pirates, a thoroughly miserable collection including George Merry, Dick Johnson, and the others, their faces haggard, their eyes bleary. "Right, you slugs!" he bellowed, his voice carrying the deceptive ring of authority. "Let's be having it then. Fortune awaits." They needed shovels, picks, anything to dig. They scavenged through the battered remains of their provisions and equipment, unearthing the few tools they possessed, along with their cutlasses and muskets. Even after weeks on the island, with all the fighting, pirates of this era still sometimes carried vast quantities of non-essential items, fine clothes, maps, or even luxury items, an odd historical fact about the clash of pirate aesthetic versus pure practicality. You were compelled to lead, guided by the tattered remains of the map in Silver's hands, along with your own, clearer recollection of the details you'd absorbed at the Admiral Benbow. "This way, boy," Silver growled, gripping your arm firmly. "No funny business, unless ye fancy a long nap in a very deep hole." The rest of the crew, grumbling but fueled by the rekindled promise of gold, followed. The jungle, hot and oppressive, immediately began its work of sapping strength and spirits. It felt like walking through a hot, wet blanket, with branches trying to slap you in the face at every turn. You imagined the entire scene being scored by the insistent buzz of particularly enormous, territorial mosquitoes, the true, unsung tormentors of tropical adventures. The journey was grueling. Silver, remarkably, seemed to suffer no ill effects from his crutch, navigating the tangled undergrowth with uncanny speed, though occasionally he'd slip on a wet root, causing a frustrated snort that sounded suspiciously like a warthog clearing its throat. The other pirates, however, less resilient, or perhaps more consumed by hangovers, sweated profusely, cursed with alarming frequency, and swatted at the persistent insects. The sounds of their complaining provided an unexpected, morbid comfort to you, knowing that at least their misery was guaranteed, gold or no gold. This path was unmarked, leading through incredibly dense thickets where only game trails existed, confirming that Flint hadn't intended for easy access to his final resting place. The oppressive humidity meant the air was thick, like breathing soup, but with less flavor and more potential for dehydration. You recognized the landmarks from the map, the distinctive grouping of tall pines on a distant hill. Spyglass Hill in person looked even more forbidding, an isolated, ancient peak shrouded in a wispy crown of clouds, the twisted path of a dried-up stream bed, and the peculiar triple humps of some minor hillocks. Every twist and turn of the trail filled you with a renewed sense of dread, for with every step you were drawing closer to the monumental disappointment that awaited them. It was like marching toward a birthday party, knowing the cake is just an empty box. After what seemed like an eternity of hacking through vines and pushing past thorny bushes, you arrived at a clearing. It was a saucer-shaped depression, marked on the map with a distinctive X. But 3 colossal pine trees, their upper branches gnarled and contorted, towered over the spot like ancient, silent guardians, the very definition of a cinematic spot. This was it. This was the place Captain Flint, the infamous scourge of the seas, had supposedly chosen to enter at his staggering fortune. The air around the clearing felt still and heavy, almost vibrating with the weight of centuries of untold avarice. The pirates erupted. Their misery was instantly replaced by a frenzied, desperate joy. They dropped their shovels, shouting like a mad choir of lunatics, their voices cracking the oppressive silence of the jungle. "Here it is! By the hook! Pieces of 8!" they screamed, their eyes gleaming with insatiable greed. The very ground seemed to vibrate with their pent-up avarice, the smell of fresh gold hanging heavy in the air, a scent conjured by their fevered imaginations. It was a bizarre, intoxicating moment, like watching someone finally hit the jackpot, only to realize the machine was unplugged. This instantaneous switch from dejection to exhilaration was a remarkable display of human hope, fueled by extreme want. It is openly debated by historians whether extreme greed often blinded pirates to clear signs of danger or futility in their quest for riches. Silver, ever the calculating one, took a deep breath, scanning the area with a sharp eye, an unnervingly serious expression replacing his temporary cheer. "Get to it, boys," he roared, pointing his crutch at the X. The remaining pirates, their eyes bulging with anticipation, began to dig with furious intensity. Their picks bit into the hard earth, their shovels scraped, creating a cacophony of sound. Dirt flew, roots were torn, as they attacked the spot with an almost manic energy, convinced that just inches below lay unimaginable wealth. They were frantic, unconcerned with technique, simply ripping at the ground with primal abandon. They had probably visualized this moment for years, the feeling of digging up a king's ransom, their reward for years of cruelty and lawlessness. You stood back, your heart sinking with a terrible certainty, knowing what was coming. The suspense for you was almost unbearable, a sick inversion of the pirates' mounting excitement. You watched their frantic digging, a slow-motion unraveling of their last desperate hope. And then the shovel of George Merry hit something hard. A gasp, a surge of anticipation. They cleared the dirt away. Not a chest, not a coffer. It was a simple plank, worn and rotted with age. They cleared more, frantic. The pit slowly deepened, and then it became horrifyingly, brutally clear. There was no treasure chest, no mound of gleaming gold, no jewels or Spanish doubloons. The pit was empty, just an open hole, a gaping wound in the earth, scarred with the ancient marks of excavation. The plank of wood they found wasn't covering treasure. It was a fragment of the remains of the old treasure chest, the detritus of someone else's success. An odd, unsettling fact for you. The original concept of hidden pirate treasure is often more fictional than fact, as most pirates spent their spoils quickly in port, often finding it too risky or impractical to bury it. Silence. A horrifying, agonizing silence, replacing the joyous shouts, broken only by the rasping breath of the frantic diggers. Their faces, caked with dirt and sweat, slowly lifted, turning from intense, hopeful concentration to disbelief, then to utter murderous fury. Their dreams of limitless wealth had just been brutally crushed by a gaping, empty hole. The light died in their eyes, replaced by a terrible, consuming rage. "It's empty," a pirate whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and outrage. "Blasted and double blasted!" George Merry screamed, tossing his shovel aside. "He tricked us! The doctor tricked us! It's that damned boy! He knew!" Their eyes, now red-rimmed and filled with a dangerous, unstable fury, turned directly on you, Jim. The blame, naturally, landed squarely on your shoulders. You had brought them here. You were the unwitting architect of their devastating disappointment. You could practically hear the collective gears turning in their addled brains. The boy led us to this. He knew it was gone. Kill him! A murderous cry went up from the desperate, betrayed men, the last vestiges of their discipline snapping like brittle, dry twigs. This was it. They weren't just angry now. They were suicidal in their desperation. It felt like watching a group of frustrated gamers suddenly realizing their prize-winning loot box was empty. Only they had actual weapons. Long John Silver, in a sudden, incredible reversal of fortune, quickly realized the perilous position. His entire crew had just fractured beyond repair, and his own life, which hung precariously on their faith in his ability to get them rich, was now worthless. He was in just as much danger as you. In a flash of self-preservation that was as terrifying as it was admirable, he leapt between you and the enraged pirates, his crutch swinging, his voice suddenly sharp with a surprising, yet very personal, authority. "Stand back, you yellow dogs!" he roared, protecting you with his very body, a decision so surprising it was almost a heroic act from the greatest villain. "There's more to this, you blasted landlubbers! More to this, I tell ye!" He scanned the tree line, his gaze now unnervingly sharp. His quick tactical pivot was a marvel to behold. Faced with an immediate lynching from his own men, Silver instantly allied himself with the boy, recognizing you as his last remaining card. The historical truth, or the version he chose to spin it as, now clicked for Silver. Ben Gunn, that half-mad hermit you mentioned from your return to the stockade must have been the true culprit. He hadn't mentioned it at the time. You hadn't mentioned Ben Gunn with them there. You'd focused on the ship. But now, all the pieces snapped into place. Livesey hadn't bluffed about the treasure being gone, and it could only have been one person. Someone living on the island, unnoticed. That mad fool and his penchant for cheese and peculiar habits. Silver, ever the pragmatist, saw the immediate, overwhelming danger. He didn't know the exact nature of Ben Gunn's involvement, but he understood instantly that the angry mob, if unleashed, would tear him apart alongside you. "This isn't over," he snarled, swinging his crutch to hold back Mary and his furious companions, who, crazed with fury, lunged forward with their cutlasses. They weren't after the treasure now. They were after blood, and yours was at the top of the list, followed closely by Silver's. Silver's transformation was startling, from mutinous ringleader to begrudging protector. It was a remarkable display of calculated opportunism, demonstrating that true survival often meant ditching loyalty and grabbing the nearest shield, even if that shield was a bewildered, exhausted teenager. You just prayed his gamble, and his surprising protection was enough to keep you both alive for whatever came next. And somehow, amidst all the chaos, the one thing you were thinking of was Ben Gunn's absolute, unwavering craving for cheese. The thought made you laugh, then sob a little bit at the utter absurdity of it all. The sudden horrifying shift in the pirate's mood from ravenous greed to murderous fury was instant and visceral. The empty treasure pit was a betrayal far deeper than any mutiny. Their eyes, devoid of hope, swiveled from the barren earth to you, Jim, the unfortunate guide. It was clear their next action was not to continue digging, but to spill blood, starting with yours. Their frustration, a raw, exposed nerve, would turn inwards if it couldn't find an external outlet. But then, as if from a dream, Long John Silver, the treacherous cook, the charming villain, the master of opportune reversals, lunged. He positioned his massive frame between you and the enraged, sword-wielding George Merry, his crutch swinging with astonishing force. "Back, ye rogues! Back, I tell ye!" he roared, his face a mask of furious desperation. His loyalty was not to you, but to himself. You were his last, dwindling sliver of hope, a walking, talking bargaining chip in a game he was rapidly losing. It was less of a rescue, and more of a really effective, spontaneous self-preservation maneuver, like shielding yourself with the nearest, and unfortunately still breathing, furniture when the walls come tumbling down. His outburst briefly stunned the furious men, their bloodlust checked by the sheer unexpectedness of Silver's defense. Just as Mary tried to push past, something else broke the silence. A high-pitched, almost feral voice, like a demented banshee on helium, rang out from the distant trees. "Ben Gunn! Ben Gunn!" And there he was, scrambling through the thick undergrowth, his clothes patched rags, his hair matted, his eyes wild. It was your odd, cheese-obsessed friend. He emerged into the clearing, grinning maniacally, clearly delighted to finally have a live audience. He had been lurking, perhaps following, drawn by the frantic shouts of digging, watching from the safety of the dense foliage, and in his hand, a musket. Ben Gunn, surprisingly coherent for a madman who thought cheese was the meaning of life, quickly fired. His shot wasn't aimed at a pirate, but upwards, a signal, a cracking echo that rippled through the humid air. And just as the remaining pirates turned their enraged gazes towards this new, absurd apparition, another volley of shots ripped through the air from the edge of the clearing, crisp and coordinated. This was the disciplined gunfire of Dr. Livesey, Captain Smollett, and the handful of loyal crewmen. They hadn't deserted after all. They had abandoned the stockade on purpose, understanding that a pitched battle from a vulnerable, exposed position with their limited numbers was a bad idea. They had been close, shadowing the treasure hunt, waiting for their moment, anticipating the very fury and disillusionment that was now ripping Silver's crew apart. They were tactical masterminds, turning disappointment into victory. This was like showing up to a high-stakes poker game, knowing the other players are holding awful hands, but still being utterly blindsided when someone at your table casually announces they hold all-leaf aces. 2 pirates instantly collapsed under the volley. The remaining 3, disoriented, terrified, and already on the brink of despair from the empty pit, broke. They screamed, not in rage, but in fear, scattering back into the oppressive tangle of the jungle, utterly defeated. It was an instant, ignominious collapse, a brutal end to their desperate chase for gold. They just ran, without so much as a parting shot. Silver, sensing his final card had been played, immediately threw down his crutch and raised his hands in surrender, muttering, "I give you my word, lads, no fight from me." In the ensuing quiet, the doctor, Squire Trelawney, and the last surviving loyal sailors stepped into the clearing, their faces grim but triumphant. Relief washed over you like a warm tide. You were safe. But it was Ben Gunn who then, with a strange, high-pitched cackle, revealed the real treasure. He led them away from the empty pit towards a small, cunningly concealed cave mouth you'd missed completely in your earlier wanderings. "The cheese, mateys! That's where the cheese is!" Ben cried, guiding them inside. And there it was, not just cheese, though you truly hoped he found some eventually, but a king's ransom of treasure, neatly piled. Ben had discovered Flint's original hideout, a much earlier one, after being marooned 3 years ago, a side project before Flint found the famous island, and had painstakingly relocated the vast majority of it to his own secret cave. He'd lived like a king for a time, then buried it again to stop him spending it on, well, more cheese, probably. All those small, mundane clues, the piles of old tools, his incessant craving for cheese, the slightly improved look to him, compared to the truly feral image, they suddenly snapped into brilliant focus. Historians still debate how long treasure from a pirated ship would remain fresh and unspoiled, given rudimentary storage conditions. But here, it was miraculously pristine, the coins sparkling. The relief among the loyalists was immense, tempered by the sight of Silver, a dejected though calculating prisoner. They now possessed the ultimate prize, a full complement of gold, and, even more crucial, the fully operational Hispaniola, thanks to your heroic, if boneheaded, earlier gambit. Silver, seeing his position, played his last hand desperately. He used his soft spot for you, his history with Jim, and his crucial influence Samoan. Over the few remaining hidden pirates still skulking in the jungle, bargaining for leniency, for life. He argued that he'd saved Jim's life, that he'd turned at the last minute, a blatant, transparent lie that nevertheless appealed to the Squire's innate sentimentality. He pointed out accurately that you, Jim, were still technically his hostage, and that you might reveal things about Ben Gunn they didn't yet fully understand if he was taken care of. A fine poker player, that Silver. He spun a tale worthy of a primetime television special. An authoritative historical fact for you. While pirating was largely outlawed, some figures from the golden age of piracy did occasionally receive royal pardons, usually for betraying their associates or for proving useful to colonial authorities. A rare occurrence, but one that fed the public's fascination with their lives. With the ship recaptured and the treasure finally located, the loyal party made swift preparations for their departure. There was no victory party, no lingering over the riches. They loaded the treasure back onto the Hispaniola, a long, grueling process that required every ounce of strength and determination. The Hispaniola looked good as new from afar, thanks to the constant sea air. From close-up, it was riddled with cannon scars and the memory of pirate nastiness, though all traces of Israel hands were carefully and quickly removed, along with anything too gross for general viewing. Ben Gunn, true to his word, assisted them with a vigor that surprised everyone, as if a large gold payload, combined with the smell of promised cheese, had temporarily cured him of 3 years of island madness. You made sure to mention to Dr. Livesey how helpful Ben was and his desire for cheese. He seemed to have made a personal oath to acquire the specific flavor. An odd fact to consider, not everyone prefers expensive imported cheeses like Stilton or Roquefort. Many actually prefer humble cheddar. You'd probably go with the cheddar too, after being stranded. They hoisted the anchor, raised the sails, and slowly, surely, the Hispaniola began to move, leaving the sun-baked, treacherous Treasure Island behind. It was a somber, yet deeply satisfying departure. They had endured mutiny, bloodshed, and deception. They had lost friends and almost lost their lives. But they had prevailed, thanks to grit, ingenuity, and a good dose of luck. And yes, an accidentally helpful madman and a cunning boy. The ocean, which had seemed so foreboding just days before, now felt like the safest, most comforting embrace in the world. The loyal party shared quiet moments of reflection, their faces turned towards the disappearing island, perhaps murmuring a silent farewell to those lost and a silent prayer of gratitude for those who remained. During the long return journey to England, something else happened. Long John Silver, still a prisoner but subtly woven into the ship's rhythm, his quick wits often put to practical use, assisting with mundane tasks like keeping a lid on any residual unrest among the last, really miserable pirates who remained. One was dying of illness. Another, O'Brien, was dead on the island from Smollett's sword, so two less to worry about than before. Eventually disappeared. One stormy night, as the ship battled against a particularly rough gale, Silver, aided by his remaining tiny share of the treasure, and possibly by his own irresistible charm, and some blind eyes turned by exhausted sailors who probably felt some weird admiration for the cunning scoundrel, somehow slipped away. He escaped with a small amount of gold and perhaps a tiny sense of satisfaction. No one pursued him. Some of the crew likely wished him well. Perhaps a quiet word between some sailors and the scoundrel was made, giving him a chance. Perhaps Dr. Livesey allowed him to leave. Historians still debate the exact details of how he might have orchestrated his final escape from such a disciplined, albeit weary, crew. He just vanished, like a shadow in the night. His ultimate fate, whether prosperity or a quiet, impoverished end, left ambiguous. It felt almost right for him. He was a force of nature, too cunning to truly be caged, a legend simply fading into the mists of lore, leaving behind only echoes of his pieces of 8 and his bizarre affection for Jim. It left you, Jim, with a slightly uncomfortable truth about the gray areas of justice and cunning. You eventually returned to England, your family safe, your quiet life transformed into something both richer and infinitely more experienced. The treasure was real, enough to secure your future, and that of Dr. Livesey and Squire Trelawney, several times over. But the true fortune you carried wasn't gold. It was the raw, undeniable proof of your own bravery, your wit, and your unexpected resilience. Treasure Island became a place of indelible memory, the terror, the friendship, the desperate survival, and the stark reality of human nature, for better and for worse. The island itself, still out there, beckoning to adventurous souls, holding its secrets. And for you, Jim, the adventures were over. For now, the future, though perhaps still calm, held the certainty that you were no longer just an innkeeper's boy, but someone who had stared into the heart of darkness, steered a ghost ship, faced down mutineers, and survived to tell a most extraordinary tale. And maybe, just maybe, Ben Gunn finally got his cheese. So, we finally come to the end of our journey, tucked in our beds, far from the crashing waves and the terrifying glint of pirate steel. The Hispaniola sails safely back into the harbor, not with a blood-red flag, but with the loyal banner waving proudly from her mast, her holds now bursting with gold. Imagine the quiet joy of land underfoot, the familiar smell of home, a deep sense of relief settling over you, much like a soft, comforting blanket drawn up to your chin. Our brave young Jim, once just an innkeeper's boy, carries with him not just the memory of adventure, but the quiet knowledge that he has truly sailed beyond the familiar, confronted the darkness, and found a resilience he never knew he possessed. He carries the wisdom that real heroes often emerge from unexpected places, sometimes from a single rash decision in an apple barrel, and that fortune often lurks in the most improbable corners, even with a half-mad, cheese-obsessed castaway. As the sun sets, casting long, peaceful shadows across the room, imagine the salty tang of the sea fading from the air, replaced by the comforting scent of freshly laundered sheets. The harsh screams of gulls turn into gentle dreams. The clatter of pirate swords softens into the murmur of your own quiet breaths. There's no more running, no more hiding, paniquing, just the tranquil knowledge of a journey completed. You're safe now. Let the distant dreams of pirate gold shimmer softly on the edges of your mind, like the last dying embers of a warm, comforting fire. Good night.